In the quiet damp of an English spring, 1,000 restless heartbeats tried to find a rhythm in the waiting. The world had narrowed down to a patchwork of green fields and heavy canvas tents, nestled deep within the rolling hills and quiet woods. If you were to walk through these hidden camps as the evening sun dipped below the tree line, you would not hear the clatter of a war machine preparing to awaken. Instead, you would hear the soft, steady sounds of life slowing down. You would hear the rustle of dry leaves under heavy boots, the muted scratch of a match striking against a stone, and the low, murmuring hum of young voices carried on the cool evening breeze. It was a strange, suspended kind of time. The air was thick with the scent of damp wool, rain-soaked earth, and the faint, sweet smoke of tobacco drifting up into the darkening canopy of leaves. Underneath the ancient oaks, ordinary boys from quiet towns and noisy cities were learning how to sit perfectly still. They were learning how to wait. There were farmhands who missed the smell of fresh hay, and shopkeepers who missed the chime of the bell above their door. There were older brothers who had promised to return, and quiet sons who had never been so far from home. Now, they were all dressed in the same rough green cloth, sitting shoulder to shoulder in a foreign landscape that felt both beautiful and terribly cold. Overhead, the clouds gathered like a soft gray blanket, trapping the evening mist against the ground. The dampness seeped into everything. It curled the edges of photographs tucked safely inside breast pockets. It made the canvas of their tents heavy and dark. But the dampness could not touch the quiet fire of memory that each man kept burning inside his mind. In the fading light, the camp transformed into a sanctuary of paper and ink. As the shadows grew long and stretched across the damp grass, the men reached for their notepads. They hunched over makeshift tables, wooden crates, flat stones, or just their own drawn-up knees. They held stubby pencils and borrowed pens, staring down at the blank, fragile pages with a reverence that was almost heartbreaking. Writing a letter in the shadow of the unknown is a delicate art. You have to carefully weigh every single word. You cannot tell your mother that you are afraid. You cannot tell your sweetheart that the ocean looks incredibly dark and angry tonight. You cannot tell your father that the silence in the camp is heavier than any noise you have ever known. And so, they wrote about the small things. The safe things. They wrote about the constant, endless English rain, making a gentle joke out of the mud that coated their boots. They wrote about the strange, warm tea they were given, and how it tasted faintly of tin. They asked about the garden back home, wondering if the tomatoes had been planted yet, or if the old dog was still sleeping on the porch. They filled their letters with ordinary sunshine, trying to fold up a piece of their own calm and mail it across the ocean. Beneath the simple words, locked between the lines, was a profound and silent plea. Remember me as I am right now. Remember this quiet boy who loves you. One young man, sitting cross-legged on a scratchy wool blanket, carefully shaded the edges of a doodle he had drawn for his little sister. He drew a smiling soldier holding an umbrella, a tiny effort to make her laugh. He didn't write about the heavy pack sitting at the foot of his cot, or the cold metal of the rifle he had spent hours cleaning until his fingers ached. He just wrote that he would bring her back a seashell, a promise pressed into the paper. Another man, older, with quiet eyes and a gentle face, wrote to a wife he had married only weeks before he left. He pressed his pen into the paper so softly, as if a heavy stroke might break the spell. He wrote about the color of the sky just before twilight, telling her that if she looked up at the exact same time, it would be as if they were standing beneath the same ceiling. He carefully folded a pressed clover into the crease of the paper, sealing a quiet wish into the envelope. As the night deepened, the letters were collected. Sacks of canvas, heavy with thousands of whispered loves and longings, were gathered up to be sent away. Watching the mailbags leave the camp was a strange comfort. It felt like sending a piece of themselves to safety, a little piece of their soul secured in a mailbox thousands of miles away, safe from whatever storm was coming. With the writing done, the silence of the camp shifted. It became the silence of anticipation. There was a secret shared among these thousands of men, a secret so immense it felt like it had its own gravity. They did not know the exact day, and they did not know the exact beach. But they knew the water was waiting. They knew that across the dark, churning expanse of the channel, a line had been drawn in the sand. Carrying a secret of that magnitude is a lonely burden, but they did not carry it entirely alone. In the hushed hours of the night, ordinary moments of kindness blossomed in the dark like tiny, fragile flowers. You could see it in the way a soldier would silently pass his canteen to a trembling neighbor without being asked. You could hear it in the soft, reassuring hum of a song, a familiar lullaby from childhood, sung under someone's breath, just loud enough for the man in the next cot to hear and feel less alone. They found comfort in the shared rhythm of their breathing. In a world that felt incredibly vast and out of their control, they focused on the small things they could touch. They polished their boots until the leather was soft and supple. They checked the buckles on their webbing, running their thumbs over the cold brass. They shared a single cigarette, passing the glowing ember between 3 or 4 hands, the brief flare of orange light illuminating tired eyes and gentle smiles. In that brief flash of light, they saw themselves reflected in each other. They were no longer strangers from different corners of the world. They were brothers, bound together by the same damp air, the same quiet fears, and the same uncertain tomorrow. There was a quiet heroism simply in staying still. Simply in enduring the wait. It takes a profound kind of courage to sit in the quiet dark, knowing that a great test is coming, and to consciously choose to hold on to your gentleness. Time, in these hidden camps, had taken on a strange and syrupy texture. It did not move in hours or minutes, but in the slow passage of light turning into shadow, and shadow giving way to the cold morning mist. A single afternoon could stretch out like an entire lifetime, filled with nothing but the sound of an old deck of cards being shuffled over and over again. The soft, rhythmic sound of the worn paper became a metronome for their waiting. They played endless games of solitaire, the kings and queens staring blindly back at them from atop green wool blankets. They played not to win, but simply to give their hands a purpose, to keep their fingers moving so their minds wouldn't wander too far out into the dark waters of the channel. When the cards were put away, they carved small pieces of wood. With quiet, deliberate strokes of a pocket knife, a rough branch gathered from the forest floor would slowly transform into a tiny, wooden dog or a simple sailboat. These little carvings were pocketed like talismans, smooth to the touch from nervous hands rubbing them in the dark. They were anchors to the physical world, solid and real against the swirling mist of their anxieties. Some men spent their endless hours reading. Books with broken spines and curled pages were passed from bunk to bunk until the words were practically memorized. They read worn poetry, thrilling adventure novels, and tattered Bibles. It didn't truly matter what the words said, it was the act of falling into another world that brought them peace. They found solace in the simple miracle of a story that had a beginning, a middle, and a guaranteed, beautiful end. A certainty that their own lives currently lacked. Every now and then, a stray dog from a nearby village would wander into the edge of the camp. It was always a moment of quiet magic. For a few brief minutes, the grim reality of their purpose dissolved. Hardened soldiers would drop to their knees in the damp grass, their faces breaking into bright, unburdened smiles as they offered a piece of hard biscuit to the timid creature. The simple, uncomplicated warmth of a dog leaning against a leg was enough to bring tears to the eyes of men who had sworn to be tough. In the soft, rhythmic thumping of a wagging tail, they remembered the innocence of the world they were fighting to protect. They clung to these fragments of normal life, hoarding them like precious gems. Because beyond the tree line, beyond the rolling, misty hills, the ocean was waiting. The sea was an ever-present ghost haunting the edges of their camp. Even when they couldn't hear the waves, they could feel the heavy, salt-laden air pressing against their skin. It was a constant reminder of the great, yawning chasm they would soon have to cross. Outside the tents, the wind began to pick up, rustling the heavy leaves of the oak trees and carrying the faint, salty scent of the sea. The ocean was not far now. Some of the men lay awake, staring up at the dark sloping canvas above them, listening to the distant rhythm of the tide crashing against the shore. The sea sounded like a slow, deep breath. It sounded inevitable. To calm his racing mind, a boy from a landlocked farm closed his eyes and tried to imagine the wheat fields back home. He pictured the way the wind would sweep across the golden stalks, making them ripple like water in the sun. He focused on the memory of warmth, pulling it around himself like a blanket against the damp English chill. Beside him, a friend shifted in his sleep, murmuring a quiet, indistinct word into his folded arms. The boy from the farm reached out in the dark, resting a hand gently on his friend's shoulder for just a moment. A silent reassurance. "I am here. We are still here." The friend's breathing steadied, slipping back into a peaceful rhythm. These were the unseen victories. The private battles fought and won in the darkest hours of the night, armed with nothing but a gentle touch and a shared stillness. As midnight approached, the camp fell into a deep, collective slumber. The thousands of individual fears, hopes, and memories merged into a single, quiet presence. The damp English countryside cradled them, wrapping them in a soft, gray mist that hid them from the world. They looked so incredibly young as they slept. Stripped of their waking anxieties, their faces softened, returning to the boys they had been just a short time ago. The harsh edges of the uniforms faded into the shadows, leaving only the delicate rise and fall of their chests. They were a sleeping giant, made not of iron and steel, but of fragile flesh, quiet hopes, and beating hearts. They were a generation waiting on the edge of the world, holding hands in the dark, preparing to step out of the shadows and into the gray light of history. But for now, the dawn was still far away. For now, there was only the gentle tap of rain against the canvas, the slow and steady breathing of a brother nearby, and the quiet, soothing promise that no matter what tomorrow held, tonight, they were safe, they were together, and they were loved. Sleep quietly, beneath the watchful trees. Let the wind carry the worries out to the dark water. Let the damp earth hold you gently in its calm. The night is quiet, the shadows are soft, and the morning is yet a dream away. In the pale, misty light of a quiet dawn, a heavy weapon of war was brought to life with nothing more than a gentle hiss of air. If you were to walk through the damp, green fields of the eastern coast, far from the real camps where young men waited, you would find a landscape that felt like a quiet, waking dream. Here, the rolling hills were covered not in iron and steel, but in canvas, wood, and shadows. It was a kingdom of illusions, carefully constructed by men with paintbrushes on their fingertips and quiet desperation in their hearts. They were the builders of a phantom army, spinning a delicate web of deceit across the empty fields. Their only mission was to tell a lie so massive and so perfectly beautiful that it might save the world. These men were not the typical soldiers you might imagine. Before the world caught fire, they were artists, architects, sound engineers, and carpenters. They were men who had spent their lives building sets for quiet theater stages or painting landscapes in sunlit studios. Now, they wore heavy green wool, and their stage was the vast, open coastline of England. They worked in a profound and gentle silence. In the damp morning air, you could hear the soft, rhythmic thud of wooden mallets driving pegs into the soft earth. You could smell the sharp, clean scent of fresh pine boards mixing with the salty breeze rolling off the channel. And if you listened closely, you would hear the strange, soft sound of canvas breathing. In the middle of a dew-soaked meadow, a young boy with grease on his cheek knelt beside what looked like a massive, fearsome tank. But as he turned a small brass valve, the heavy armor did not roar with the sound of a mechanical engine. Instead, it sighed. It was made entirely of rubber and pressurized air. The boy placed his hands gently on the cold, swelling fabric, smoothing out the wrinkles as it grew. It was an absurd thing to touch. It felt like a giant, discarded toy resting in the morning mist. He could have pushed it over with a single shoulder. Yet, as he patted the side of the inflated machine, there was no laughter in his eyes. He treated the fragile balloon with a quiet, sacred reverence. He knew that from thousands of feet in the air, through the lens of a lonely enemy scout plane, this delicate pocket of air looked like an anchor of solid steel. Every wrinkle he smoothed out, every shadow he painted onto the rubber tracks, was a shield for a brother he had never met. Across the field, a former scenic painter from London stood before a massive sheet of stretched canvas. He held a wide brush, his hand moving with the graceful, sweeping motions of a dancer. He was painting the shadow of a barracks building that did not exist. He blended dark grays and soft charcoals, creating the illusion of depth where there was only flat cloth. As he painted, his mind wandered westward, toward the real camps hidden in the forests. He thought of his younger brother, an infantryman waiting in the cold rain. He wondered if his brother was awake, if he was afraid, if he was holding a letter from their mother. The painter dipped his brush into the dark pigment, blending it softly into the canvas. He whispered a quiet promise to the empty air, hoping that his painted shadows would draw the darkness away from his brother's real world. He painted with a desperate love, knowing that his art was the only armor he could provide. The deception extended far beyond what the eye could see. It reached up into the invisible, crackling currents of the sky. In a small, drafty wooden hut hidden beneath a canopy of trees, a solitary man sat hunched over a metal desk. A pair of heavy black headphones clamped over his ears, and his fingers rested lightly on the cold plastic knob of a telegraph key. The room was perfectly still, lit only by the soft, warm glow of a single glass vacuum tube. He was a radio operator, but the messages he sent were beautiful, intricate fictions. He tapped his finger in a rhythmic, bouncing cadence, sending invisible pulses of energy out into the dark ether. Click, clack. Click, click, clack. He was having a conversation with ghosts. He pretended to be a busy general, ordering the movement of thousands of imaginary men. He complained about imaginary delays in the imaginary supply lines. He requested winter coats for a division made of nothing but air and wood. It was a deeply lonely performance. He sat in the quiet dark, pouring all of his energy into a void, hoping that somewhere across the cold water, someone was listening and believing. Sometimes, his hand would begin to tremble. The weight of the lie would suddenly press down on his narrow shoulders. What if he tapped too fast? What if his rhythm gave away his youth, his nervousness? What if the enemy realized that this massive, bustling headquarters was just one tired boy sitting in a drafty shed with a cup of cold tea? When the anxiety crept in, he would close his eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and think of his grandmother's garden. He would imagine the steady, unhurried ticking of the grandfather clock in her hallway. Tick. Tock. He would align his breathing with that gentle memory, and his hand would steady. He would press the key again, sending a calm, confident lie out into the night, wrapping the real army in a blanket of invisible sound. When evening fell over the phantom camps, the artists and the radio men gathered in their tents, much like the real soldiers did. But their isolation was uniquely heavy. They carried a secret within a secret. When they sat on their cots to write letters home, their pens hovered awkwardly over the paper. They could not speak of the inflatable tanks. They could not write about the wooden airplanes they had built that afternoon, or the fake tire tracks they had pressed into the mud with heavy rollers. They were men whose entire existence had become a heavily guarded fiction. So, they wrote about the moonlight. They wrote about the flocks of birds that would sometimes land on their canvas illusions, entirely unbothered by the fake war around them. They wrote about how much they missed the smell of real baking bread and the sound of laughter in a crowded room. One young engineer, who spent his days wiring massive loudspeakers to project the recorded sounds of marching boots across empty valleys, wrote to his wife. He did not tell her that he was playing a symphony of ghosts. Instead, he wrote about a small, stray cat that had wandered into his tent. He described how the cat had curled up on his wool blanket, purring with a deep, rumbling warmth that vibrated against his chest. He wrote that holding the sleeping animal made him feel tethered to the real world, a world that felt so terribly far away. They sealed their letters, these quiet custodians of the grand illusion, feeling a strange detachment from themselves. They were the shadows casting the shadows. As the night deepened, the magic trick took on an eerie, poetic beauty. The fake wooden airplanes, parked perfectly in rows, cast long, silvery silhouettes under the light of the moon. The rubber tanks sat like slumbering beasts in the tall grass. The giant speakers hummed quietly, ready to whisper their loud, mechanical lies into the wind. The men who built them walked the perimeter in the dark, checking the ropes and the canvas. They moved softly, almost tiptoeing, as if they were afraid of waking the very things they had created. Two soldiers paused by a canvas truck that was sagging slightly in the damp night air. Without a word, they worked together, their hands moving in quiet synchrony. One held the fabric taut, while the other adjusted the wooden frame inside, pulling the illusion tight once more. When they were finished, they stood shoulder to shoulder in the dark, looking out toward the unseen ocean. They shared a silent understanding. They knew that their work was a fragile thing. A strong gust of wind could blow away a tank. A heavy rain could wash away the painted shadows. But they also knew that every hour their illusion held, every day the enemy stared at this empty coast instead of the real one, was another day the boys in the real camps got to breathe. They were not holding rifles, and they were not preparing to storm a beach. But in the quiet devotion of their hands, and the careful smoothing of rubber and the steady tapping of a telegraph key, there was a profound and beautiful heroism. They were weaving a protective spell out of thin air, wrapping it around thousands of beating hearts they would never look in the eye. So let the wind blow softly over the phantom army tonight. Let the moon cast gentle shadows over the canvas and the wood. The men of the real army are sleeping in the damp forests far away, dreaming of home, unaware of the invisible shield being held above them by artists in the dark. The artists rest their weary hands. The radio hums its quiet tune. The illusion is safe. The secret holds. And the dawn is just a little further away. A single breath of cold wind carried a warning that no army could fight. In a quiet room tucked away from the sprawling camps and the restless men, a solitary figure stood gazing out at a darkening sky. He was not a general with a chest full of medals, nor was he a soldier with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He was a quiet man with tired, gentle eyes, surrounded by the soft ticking of barometers and the rustling of large, fragile paper maps. He was a reader of the wind and the clouds. And in the silence of his small, drafty office, he felt the heavy, invisible weight of the atmosphere dropping, pressing down upon his shoulders like a physical burden. Through the panes of his window, the English Channel stretched out, transforming from a tranquil gray mirror into a restless, churning expanse of dark water. The air in the room smelled of old paper, cold tea, and the sharp, metallic tang of the approaching storm. He traced the sweeping lines on his charts with a soft lead pencil, the delicate scratching sound a stark contrast to the immense forces of nature he was trying to understand. These swirling lines were not just weather patterns, they were the arbiters of life and death. Every sweeping curve of low pressure, every jagged edge of a storm front, held the fate of thousands of young boys sleeping in the damp forests below. The meteorologist rubbed his weary eyes, feeling a profound and terrifying loneliness. The greatest armada the world had ever known was coiled and ready to spring. Ships were fueled, faces were painted, and whispered goodbyes had already been cast into the wind. But as he looked at the glass of the barometer, the needle trembled and fell. The storm was not turning away. It was coming straight for them. Nature, indifferent to the plans of men, was building a wall of wind and water that no canvas boat or wooden glider could survive. He had to deliver the message that would halt the turning gears of history. It was a heartbreaking pause. With a quiet, heavy heart, the word was passed down through the shadowy corridors of command. Not tonight. The sky is too angry. The sea is too cruel. You must wait. Down in the sprawling, hidden camps, the news rippled through the damp trees like a long, collective sigh. The boys had been wound up so tight, their nerves stretched like the strings of an instrument ready to be played. They had packed their kits with trembling hands, they had written their final letters, they had made their peace with the quiet dark. And now, they had to slowly, agonizingly, unspool that tension. Imagine the feeling of bracing yourself for a jump into cold water, muscles tight, eyes closed, only to be told to step back from the edge. The relief is there, yes, but it is instantly swallowed by a deep, exhausting deflation. The waiting, which had already felt like an eternity, was now extended into an empty, hollow tomorrow. Outside their canvas tents, the sky broke open. The rain began to fall, not in an angry torrent, but in a steady, heavy, relentless sheet of gray water. It lashed against the window panes of the meteorologist's office, blurring the glass and obscuring the restless sea. It drummed against the taut canvas of the tents, a million tiny, rhythmic taps that filled the air with a hypnotic, rushing sound. Inside the tents, the men sat on their cots, surrounded by their packed gear, feeling suddenly lost. The adrenaline that had kept the cold at bay slowly seeped out of them, leaving only the damp chill of the English countryside. In one tent, a young farm boy sat staring at his heavy boots, the mud from the afternoon still clinging to the soles. He had spent the last 3 hours mentally saying goodbye to his family's fields, to the smell of the morning dew on the wheat. Now, he had to gather those goodbyes back up and tuck them away, unsure of what to do with them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tattered photograph of his mother standing on the porch. He traced the outline of her face with a calloused thumb, his heart aching with a sudden, sharp homesickness that the delay had brought rushing back to the surface. Across the tent, an older soldier quietly opened his pack. He took out a small, tin stove and a crumpled packet of coffee. Without saying a word, he struck a match, the sudden flare of warm orange light pushing back the gloomy gray shadows. As the water began to boil, sending a fragile wisp of steam into the damp air, he poured 2 cups. He handed one to the young farm boy. Their fingers brushed against the warm tin. No words were spoken. None were needed. In the quiet sharing of that bitter, warm drink, there was an anchor. A gentle reminder that they were still here, they were still breathing, and they were still together in the waiting. The pause forced men back into their own minds, a place that could be far more frightening than the dark water of the channel. When the momentum stops, the doubts begin to creep in, quiet as shadows. Some men tried to sleep, pulling their itchy wool blankets up over their ears to muffle the sound of the rain. But sleep was an elusive friend. They would drift into a light, restless doze, only to be jolted awake by a sudden gust of wind rattling the tent poles, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Others turned back to their paper and pens. But what do you write when you have already said your final goodbye? A young man from a noisy city sat cross-legged, a blank sheet of paper resting on his knee. He had already mailed a beautiful, poetic letter to his sweetheart, telling her not to worry. Now, he felt foolish. He felt small. He chewed on the end of his pencil, watching a single drop of water slowly trace a path down the inside of the canvas wall. He didn't write about the fear. He simply wrote, "It is raining today. The sound of it is quite peaceful. I am thinking of the day we walked through the park with the umbrella, and how you laughed when the wind turned it inside out. I am holding on to that laugh today." He folded the note into a tiny square and tucked it into his breast pocket, right over his heart. A paper shield against the storm. Up in his lonely room, the meteorologist had not moved. The cup of tea on his desk had long since grown cold. The wind howled against his window panes, a mournful, hollow sound that seemed to carry the voices of all those waiting boys. He watched the needles of his instruments with an obsessive, tender care. He was not just measuring barometric pressure or wind speed, he was searching for a miracle. He was looking for a tiny fracture in the storm's armor, a brief, fleeting window of calm where the sea might lie flat just long enough to let the fragile boats cross. He felt a profound, aching responsibility for every single life resting in the muddy camps below. He knew that if he kept them waiting too long, the secret would be lost, and the chance would vanish. But if he sent them into the teeth of this gale, the sea would swallow them before they ever saw the shore. He stood up and pressed his forehead against the cold, wet glass of the window. The chill seeped into his skin, a sharp reminder of the reality outside. He closed his eyes and breathed into the silence of the room. He whispered a quiet plea to the wind, asking it to tire, asking it to blow itself out and leave behind a gentle morning. As the afternoon bled into evening, and the evening surrendered to a dark, starless night, the storm raged on. But within the camps, a quiet, stubborn resilience began to take root in the damp earth. The initial deflation gave way to a soft, enduring acceptance. The men realized that they could not fight the rain, nor could they control the wind. All they could control was how they sat in the dark. A chaplain, his uniform as damp and wrinkled as any other, walked slowly through the muddy paths between the tents. He did not preach grand sermons or speak of righteous glory. He simply stopped at the flap of a tent, leaned his head inside, and offered a soft, tired smile. He asked about their hometowns. He asked about their dogs. He listened to their quiet voices murmuring over the sound of the rain. His presence was a warm hearth in the cold night, a reminder of the grace and gentleness that existed outside the realm of war. In the deepest hours of the night, when the wind was at its loudest, the camp felt like a single, breathing organism. The thousands of men were no longer just an army waiting to attack, they were a brotherhood of the paused. They were united by the sound of the rain, by the chill in their bones, and by the shared, unspoken hope that the sun would eventually return. The meteorologist remained at his post, a silent sentinel in the dark. The needle on the glass dial twitched. A fraction of a millimeter. A minuscule shift in the invisible weight of the world. He leaned closer, holding his breath, afraid that even the sound of his own exhalation might frighten the delicate change away. The storm was still howling, the window panes were still rattling, but deep within the swirling lines of his charts, he saw the faintest whisper of a promise. A tiny, fragile clearing, blooming like a pale flower in a field of dark gray. But for tonight, the rain would continue to fall. Let the sound of the water washing over the canvas soothe the restless minds. Let the cold wind stay outside the heavy wool blankets. The boys are safe in their damp, quiet world for just a little longer. They are wrapped in a cocoon of suspended time, dreaming of home, dreaming of peace, while the storm outside sings its heavy, sorrowful lullaby. Rest now, beneath the drumming rain. The night is long, the waiting is hard, but you are not alone in the dark. The winds will eventually tire, the heavy clouds will eventually break, and the dawn, when it finally comes, will find you together. Sleep softly, while the storm holds the world still. In the heavy hours just before dawn, the fate of the world rested on the quietest of words. It was a room filled with the soft, faded scent of stale tobacco and old, polished leather. Outside, the rain lashed against the tall, heavy window panes, a constant, drumming reminder of the storm that had held them all captive. Inside, the air was thick, weighed down by exhaustion and the silent, unspoken fears of men who had carried the world on their shoulders for far too long. Grown men, leaders who had spent their entire lives studying maps and moving invisible pieces across paper oceans, sat with tired eyes staring into empty porcelain teacups. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic, indifferent ticking of a wooden mantel clock. It was the sound of time slipping away, drop by precious drop. At the center of this quiet, breathing storm sat one man. In this moment, he did not look like a grand monument of history. He did not look like a conqueror. He looked like a father who had not slept in many nights. The lines around his eyes were carved deep by worry, and he felt the profound weight of millions of whispered prayers pressing down upon his tired shoulders. Deep in his pocket, his fingers traced the folded edge of a small piece of paper. It was a letter he had written by himself, in the lonely hours of the night. It was a letter claiming complete and total responsibility if everything they were about to do ended in sorrow. He kept touching the rough texture of the paper, finding a strange, heartbreaking comfort in knowing that if the dark waters swallowed his boys, he would carry the blame alone. He would not let it fall on anyone else. The door to the room opened softly, the brass hinges offering a gentle, muted squeak. The quiet man of the weather stepped in, bringing with him the faint, sharp smell of ozone and damp wool. He carried a fresh chart, the paper slightly curled at the edges. He spoke of a fleeting window. He spoke of a brief, tired sigh in the wind. A fragile gap in the heavy, rolling clouds. It was not a promise of warm sunshine or calm, glassy waters. It was merely a promise of a chance. A tiny sliver of hope wedged between two violent storms. The room fell completely silent. The ticking of the clock seemed to stretch out, growing louder in the stillness. Every eye in the room rested on the man sitting at the center of the table. He looked down at the polished wood. He did not see his own reflection. He saw the faces of the young boys sleeping in the mud beneath the dripping oak trees. He saw the thin canvas of the flat-bottomed boats. He thought of the cold, dark water of the channel, waiting in the night. He thought of the sweethearts who had kissed these boys goodbye, and the mothers who were keeping candles lit in quiet windows across the sea. The weight of the moment was an ocean, and he was standing alone on the shore. He closed his eyes. He took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool, stale air of the room fill his lungs. He held it for just a second, a final moment of absolute stillness before the turning of the tide. And then, he opened his eyes. The terrible, agonizing wait was over. He gave a gentle, almost imperceptible nod. And with a voice that barely rose above a whisper, a voice softened by exhaustion and deep, abiding love, he spoke the word. Okay. Let's go. It was a pebble dropped into a vast, dark pond. That single, soft command traveled outward in quiet, invisible ripples. It slipped through the copper wires hidden inside the walls of the old house. It flashed down to dimly lit switchboards, where young women with tired, kind smiles sat in the dark. They quietly unplugged cords and pressed them into new sockets, sending the delicate pulse out into the stormy night. The word traveled across the wet English countryside, moving faster than the wind. It slipped through the sleepy villages, over the empty, rain-slicked roads, and settled like a soft blanket over the hidden forests where the great phantom army slept. Down in the dark, damp woods, the quiet spell of the pause was finally broken. It did not break with a harsh siren or a sudden shout. It broke with the soft, wet rustle of canvas tent flaps being pushed aside. Sergeants, who were not much older than the boys they watched over, walked slowly through the tall, wet grass. They pointed their flashlights down at the mud so the beams wouldn't blind anyone, and they leaned into the dark tents, whispering into the shadows. Time to wake up, boys. It's time. Inside the tents, the boys stirred. The heavy, dreamless sleep fell away, replaced by a sudden, sharp clarity. The endless waiting, the terrible limbo of the past few days, had evaporated into the mist. The relief was profound, but it was mingled with a quiet, breathless awe. They did not speak much. There was no need for grand, dramatic speeches. The silence between them was rich with understanding. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace. The chill of the night air crept in, but their hands were steady. A young man from a smoky factory town sat on his cot, carefully folding his extra pair of drywall socks. He tucked them deep into the bottom of his canvas pack, patting them down like a precious treasure. A simple comfort hidden away for a tomorrow he could not yet see. Across the tent, two friends stood shoulder to shoulder in the dim, flickering light of a single lantern. They helped each other adjust the heavy canvas straps of their webbing. The material was stiff and cold from the damp air. One boy reached out and gently straightened the collar of the other's jacket, folding it down so it wouldn't chafe against his neck. It was a tiny, domestic gesture of care, a gentle brush of humanity in the middle of a dark forest at the edge of the world. Another boy, barely old enough to shave, sat on the edge of his cot. He held a small, silver locket in the palm of his hand. He didn't open it. He already knew every line of the photograph inside by heart. He simply pressed the cool metal to his lips, closing his eyes for a long moment. Then, he slipped the locket beneath his rough wool shirt, letting it rest gently against his skin, right over his beating heart. It was his anchor. His reminder of the warmth that existed somewhere beyond the cold, gray water. Outside the tents, the camp stoves hissed quietly in the dark. The smell of bitter coffee and damp earth drifted through the trees. Men gathered around the small, orange flames, cupping the warm tin mugs in both hands to draw the heat into their fingers. They shared a final, quiet smoke. The glowing embers of their cigarettes danced in the dark like slow-moving fireflies. They passed the smokes back and forth, the brief flare of light catching a nervous smile, a reassuring wink, a shared nod. They were drinking in these last moments of stillness. They were holding onto the solid earth beneath their boots. Slowly, the camps began to empty. Thousands of shadows stepped out from beneath the dripping canopies of the ancient oaks. They moved in a long, quiet line toward the gravel roads. The heavy rain had softened into a gentle, cooling mist, kissing their flushed cheeks and settling like tiny diamonds on their wool shoulders. The only sound in the night was the rhythmic crunch of boots on the gravel, a steady, hypnotic heartbeat of a generation moving forward together. They were leaving the safety of the earth for the profound uncertainty of the water. But as they walked shoulder to shoulder in the dark, a strange, beautiful peace settled over them. The agonizing torment of the unknown, the days of sitting and staring at the canvas walls, had been replaced by the simple, comforting reality of the next step. They did not have to worry about tomorrow anymore. They only had to worry about the man walking beside them. They only had to keep moving, one foot in front of the other, following the quiet path laid out before them. They were no longer waiting. They were a gentle river of quiet courage, flowing slowly and steadily toward the sea. And back in that smoke-filled room, far away from the damp gravel roads, the man who had spoken the words sat entirely alone. The others had quietly filed out, leaving him to the silence. He listened to the rain tapping against the glass. He felt the immense, hollow quiet of a decision made. He closed his eyes once more, visualizing the long lines of boys walking through the mist. He wrapped his thoughts around them like a heavy, protective coat. He could not stop the wind, and he could not flatten the waves, but he could offer them his silent, enduring prayer. Walk gently into the night. Let the mist hide your fears. Let the shoulder of your brother be your strength. The waiting is over, the path is chosen, and the dark water is ready to carry you forward. Breathe softly, walk steadily, and let the quiet night guide you on your way. High above the sleeping earth, a fragile wooden bird carried the hopes of the world on wings of brittle pine and stretched cloth. Down on the darkened airfields, the damp English mist clung heavily to the grass, wrapping the world in a soft, gray blanket. If you had stood at the edge of the runway in those quiet, pre-dawn hours, you would not have seen machines of iron and steel. Instead, resting quietly in the gloom, were rows of delicate, silent silhouettes. They looked like giant, overgrown toys, pieced together with nothing more than thin plywood, taut canvas, and the gentle, careful hands of craftsmen who usually built furniture for quiet parlors. These were the gliders. They had no engines to roar into the night. They had no armor to turn away the storm. They were simply hollow wooden shells, light enough to be carried by the wind, yet burdened with the heaviest cargo a fragile thing could ever hold. Out of the tree line, emerging from the shadows like a procession of quiet ghosts, came the boys who would fly them. Their faces were darkened, streaked with burnt cork and soot to hide the pale innocence of their youth from the moonlight. Underneath the dark paint, they were still the same boys who had written letters about gardens and sweethearts just a few hours before. But now, in the heavy, woolen gear that weighed them down, they moved with a slow, cumbersome grace. They looked almost like deep-sea divers preparing to sink into a vast, dark ocean. The silence on the airfield was profound. There were no marching bands, no shouted orders, no speeches of grand glory. There was only the soft crunch of heavy rubber boots on the damp tarmac, and the quiet, steady rhythm of breathing. As they approached the wooden bellies of the gliders, they reached out and touched the sides. The canvas felt cold and rough beneath their fingertips. It smelled sharply of airplane dope, glue, and fresh sawdust, a smell that reminded one young boy from the country of his father's carpentry shed on a quiet Sunday afternoon. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the familiar scent ground him, letting it wrap around him like a protective memory. Stepping into the glider was like stepping into a small, echoing cave. The wooden floorboards creaked softly beneath their weight. The space was incredibly tight, a narrow wooden tube where knees pressed against knees, and shoulders leaned against shoulders. In the dim light, they settled onto the hard wooden benches. They were so close to one another that they could feel the radiating warmth of the man sitting next to them. In this dark, cramped space, that shared warmth became their anchor. One soldier, a quiet boy who rarely spoke above a whisper, fumbled with something deep inside his oversized pocket. His fingers traced the smooth, worn edges of a small wooden spool. It was a spool of thread his mother had given him, a simple, everyday object from her sewing kit. She had placed it in his hand and told him it was to mend his socks, but he knew what she really meant. She was giving him a piece of home, a tangible tether to the quiet living room where she sat in her rocking chair. He rolled the spool between his thumb and forefinger, over and over, finding a deeply soothing rhythm in the repetition. Across the narrow aisle, another boy sat with his eyes closed. Tucked safely inside the webbing of his helmet was a small, folded piece of pale blue paper. It was a letter he had received weeks ago, read so many times the creases were worn soft as velvet. He didn't need to see the words to know what they said. He let the memory of the handwriting, the soft loops and gentle curves of ink, wash over his mind, pushing away the cold reality of the wooden walls around him. A gentle hand reached out in the dark and rested on a trembling knee. No words were spoken. The older boy beside him just gave a soft, reassuring squeeze. A silent promise that said, "I am here. We are in this small wooden boat together." Suddenly, the quiet of the airfield was broken by the distant, deep rumble of the tow planes. The sound grew, a heavy, throbbing vibration that resonated through the wooden floorboards and traveled up into the very bones of the men waiting inside. Through the small, cloudy perspex windows, they could see the thick, heavy ropes being stretched out, linking their fragile canvas wings to the powerful engines of the planes ahead. It was a lifeline forged in the dark. When the tug came, it was a firm, heavy pull. The glider groaned, the wood creaking and shifting as it was dragged forward. They bumped along the uneven grass, the hollow belly of the craft amplifying every stone and dip in the earth. The boys gripped the edges of their wooden benches, their knuckles pale in the dim light, their breathing suspended in their chests. And then, with a soft, sweeping motion, the rumbling stopped. The wheels left the damp grass. The heavy, jolting connection to the earth vanished, replaced by an incredibly smooth, floating sensation. They were airborne. To fly in a wooden box behind a roaring airplane is a strange and surreal experience. The noise of the tow plane ahead is a muffled, constant drone, but inside the glider itself, there is only the sound of the wind. It rushes over the stretched canvas like a great, invisible river. It hums and whistles through the tiny gaps in the wooden frame, singing a high, lonely, and beautiful song. The boys sat in the shadows, swaying gently as the glider rode the invisible currents of the night sky. Through the small windows, the world below had transformed. The familiar, muddy camps of England were gone. In their place was a vast, shimmering expanse of dark silver. The English Channel. It looked peaceful from so high up, a quiet mirror reflecting the pale light of the stars. Suspended between the stars above and the silver water below, time seemed to slow down and stretch out into a deep, meditative calm. In the back of the glider, someone began to softly hum a tune. It was a gentle, melancholy melody, a song about a valley bathed in twilight and a river winding home. The sound was so quiet, so delicate, that it almost blended into the rushing of the wind. But the other boys heard it. One by one, they let their heads lean back against the thin plywood walls. Some closed their eyes, letting the soft humming wrap around them like a warm blanket. They were floating. They were untethered from the heavy, muddy world. For this brief, magical hour, they were not soldiers preparing for a storm. They were simply passengers in a quiet, drifting dream, carried by the night wind. The young boy with the burnt cork on his face looked out the window. He watched the moon slip behind a thin veil of clouds, casting a soft, pearlescent glow over the water. He felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. The endless waiting was over. The loud, chaotic world had faded away, leaving only the hypnotic hum of the canvas and the steady, reassuring presence of his brothers sitting in the dark beside him. As they neared the unseen coast, a sudden, muffled clunk echoed through the cabin. It was the sound of the heavy tow rope detaching. The lifeline had been released. Instantly, the distant drone of the tow plane faded away, swallowed by the vastness of the sky. What followed was a silence so deep, so pure, it felt almost sacred. The glider was no longer being pulled. It was truly flying now. It became a silent ghost, a shadow slipping through the velvet night. The rushing of the wind softened to a gentle, breathy whisper. The wooden frame swayed and dipped with a graceful, heavy elegance, a slow dance in the dark. Inside the cabin, the boys held their breath. They were falling now, a slow, controlled descent toward a foreign land wrapped in shadows. But in the deep quiet of their downward glide, there was no panic. There was only a quiet, beautiful surrender to gravity, and to whatever the soft, wet earth below had waiting for them. They clutched their good luck charms a little tighter. The smooth river stone. The wooden spool. The pale blue letter. They squeezed the hands of the men beside them, the unspoken bond of their brotherhood glowing brightly in the pitch-black cabin. They were falling together. Drift softly, gentle wings of canvas and wood. Let the wind carry you like a falling leaf through the quiet night. The boys inside your hollow shell are resting their eyes, listening to the soothing lullaby of the air rushing past. They are suspended in the beautiful, silent space between what was and what will be. Let the night cradle them in its dark, velvet hands. Let their descent be slow, let their breathing be calm, and let the quiet, starlit sky watch over them as they slip silently toward the dawn. To step from a trembling metal floor into the boundless, rushing night is to leave the world you know entirely behind. For a young man standing at the open door of an airplane, the wind was a deafening, physical wall. It roared against his heavy wool uniform, pulling at his canvas straps, screaming in his ears. He was surrounded by the tense, heavy breathing of the boys pressed in line behind him, a human chain of shared fear and quiet determination. But the moment he stepped out into the void, the roaring world vanished. There was a sudden, violent jolt, a breathless second of tumbling through the freezing air, and then, a miracle of silk blossomed above him. The parachute opened, catching the wind like a great, white sail. And instantly, the terrible noise was gone. It was replaced by a silence so profound, so absolute, it felt as though he had slipped into a dream. The massive engines of the plane faded into a distant, muted hum, moving away to leave him perfectly, beautifully alone. He hung suspended in the velvet darkness, a single, fragile pendulum swinging gently beneath a canopy of stars. For a boy who had grown up in a crowded city apartment, surrounded by the constant clatter of streetcars and the voices of a dozen neighbors, this was a kind of solitude he had never known. Up here, in the cold, quiet air, there were no commanders. There were no maps. There was only the soft, sighing rustle of the wind moving through the thin nylon cords, a sound like a gentle exhalation of breath. He looked down, searching for the solid earth, but there was only a vast ocean of black ink. The wind, indifferent to the careful plans drawn on paper in distant, smoke-filled rooms, gathered him up. It caught the silk and carried him away from his intended mark, drifting him like a solitary autumn leaf across the dark Norman sky. As he fell, time seemed to slow, stretching out into a long, suspended moment of pure reflection. He thought of his front porch back home, the way the wooden boards would creak under his father's rocking chair on a summer evening. He wondered if his mother was asleep, or if she was awake, looking out her kitchen window at the same moon that was currently hiding behind the European clouds. He felt a profound, aching love for those simple, quiet things. The things he was falling through the dark to protect. Beneath him, the shadows began to take shape. The earth was rising to meet him. But it was not the dry, flat drop zones he had memorized from blurry photographs. The wind had scattered the boys far and wide, tossing them blindly into an ancient, unfamiliar landscape. Instead of an open field, he crashed through the heavy, wet canopy of an old apple orchard. Branches whipped and snapped against his heavy canvas suit, breaking his fall as he tumbled through the leaves, finally coming to rest with a heavy thud in the tall, dew-soaked grass. He lay there for a long moment, the breath knocked from his lungs, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was alive. He was whole. But as he slowly unbuckled his heavy harness, the canvas stiff and clumsy in his trembling fingers, the overwhelming reality of the night settled around him. He was entirely alone. In another part of the dark, miles away from the orchard, another boy fell not into grass, but into the shocking, breathless cold of deep water. The enemy had flooded the low pastures, turning dry land into a hidden, treacherous lake. He splashed down, the heavy parachute silk collapsing over him like a suffocating shroud. Panic flared in his chest, wild and bright, as the water seeped through his boots and pulled at his heavy gear. But in the freezing dark, a quiet instinct took over. The memory of his older brother teaching him to swim in a muddy creek back home flashed in his mind. "Don't fight the water," his brother had said, "just find the bottom." He took a breath, reached for his knife, and began to cut the tangled cords. He moved slowly, deliberately, fighting the panic with every slice of the blade, until he finally broke free, wading toward the shadowy outline of a grassy bank. He pulled himself from the water, shivering violently, his wool uniform heavy and dripping. He crawled beneath the sweeping roots of a massive willow tree and huddled into a small ball, trying to preserve whatever warmth was left in his body. The silence of the flooded field was heavy and damp. He had never felt so small in all his life. This was the quiet terror of the scattered drop. To be dropped into the pitch-black void, far from anyone you knew, surrounded by shadows that could hide anything. In the crushing loneliness of the night, their first instinct was not to fight, but to find a friend. They needed to know that they were not the only ones left in the world. And so, the search began. A careful, whispered game of hide-and-seek played out in the dark. A boy creeping along the edge of a thick, thorny hedgerow paused, holding his breath. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, brass toy. It was a simple child's novelty, a little metal cricket that made a snapping sound when you pressed it. A toy meant for a playroom floor, now holding the desperate hopes of a lonely soldier. He pressed his thumb against the metal. Click-clack. The sound was sharp, incredibly loud in the still night air. It felt as though he had just shouted his presence to the entire world. He froze, his hand gripping the cold metal of his rifle, straining his ears against the silence. The seconds stretched out, agonizing and hollow. There was only the rustle of the wind in the leaves, and the distant, mournful hoot of an owl. His heart sank. He was about to move on, to step back into the terrifying isolation of the shadows, when he heard it. From the other side of the thick brambles, a soft, answering reply. Click-clack. Click-clack. The relief that washed over him was physical, a warm, heavy wave that made his knees weak. He pushed through the wet leaves and tangled branches, not caring about the scratches on his face. Two shadows met in the gloom. They didn't know each other's names. They belonged to different companies, they had flown in different planes, but in this dark, lonely wood, they were brothers. One had lost his helmet in the drop. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat and rain. The other had lost his supply pack and was shivering from the cold. They sat down heavily against the broad trunk of an ancient oak tree, letting out a long, collective breath. "You got any water?" the bare-headed boy whispered, his voice cracking just a little. The shivering boy nodded in the dark. He unhooked his canteen, his fingers clumsy with the cold, and passed it over. He then reached deep into his pocket and pulled out a slightly crushed piece of chocolate he had saved from his rations in England. He broke it in half, pressing the small, sweet square into the other boy's palm. They sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing the water and the chocolate in the pitch-black forest. The simple sweetness of the candy was a tether, pulling them back from the edge of fear, reminding them of the gentle world they had left behind. They didn't speak of the war. They didn't speak of the morning that was coming. They whispered about the strangeness of the soft, muddy earth beneath them. The shivering boy whispered about how the flooded fields smelled exactly like the marshes behind his grandfather's farm in Louisiana. The other boy listened, finding immense comfort simply in the sound of a voice that spoke his language, a voice that carried the familiar cadence of home. All across the dark Norman countryside, these tiny, quiet reunions were happening. A boy hanging helplessly by his parachute harness from the high branches of a tall elm tree heard a rustle in the grass below. He held his breath, terrified, until a soft voice drifted up from the shadows. "Hold still, kid. I've got a knife." Another shadow climbed the trunk, gently cutting the cords, lowering the trapped boy into the waiting arms of two strangers who had followed the sound of the snapping branches. They gathered in twos and threes, huddling in dry ditches, beneath the eaves of empty barns, and behind the stone walls of quiet, sleeping villages. They bandaged scraped hands with pieces of torn cloth. They shared dry socks and quiet words of encouragement. The fear did not vanish, but it softened. It was no longer a sharp, isolating terror. It became a shared burden, distributed among the quiet groups of boys who sat close together to share their body heat. They found an unexpected, profound courage in the shadows, born entirely from the presence of the man sitting next to them. The wind had scattered them like seeds across a strange and frightening land. But in the dark, those seeds were taking root. They were finding each other, linking hands in the gloom, weaving a fragile, invisible net of humanity across the cold fields. They realized that the dark was not just a place of hiding, it was a blanket that offered them a moment of peace before the dawn. It was a space to catch their breath, to remember who they were, and to gather the quiet strength they would need when the sun finally rose. So let the wind rustle softly through the apple trees. Let the flooded fields sit calm and still like dark mirrors under the night sky. The boys are no longer falling. They have found the earth, and more importantly, they have found each other. They lean against the ancient, mossy bark of the woods, their breathing slowing, their eyes heavy with the profound exhaustion of their journey. They share a quiet space in the shadows, holding onto the simple, beautiful comfort of a whispered voice and a shared piece of candy. Sleep, if only for a fleeting moment, beneath the gentle canopy of the leaves. The night is holding you now. The lonely fall is over. You are together in the quiet dark, and the morning is still a long, peaceful dream away. The earth reached up in the dark, turning a silent dream into a sudden, splintered waking. As the fragile wooden gliders descended through the velvet night, the world below looked deceptively soft. Through the small, clouded windows, the young men watched the Norman countryside rise to meet them. Bathed in the pale, silver light of the moon, the fields looked like a patchwork quilt of deep greens and shadowy grays, stitched together by ancient stone walls and thick, sleeping hedgerows. It looked like a painting of a quiet country evening, a place where one might lay down a blanket and fall asleep under the stars. But beneath the beautiful, rolling mist that clung to the damp grass, the fields were harboring a cruel secret. The boys sitting shoulder to shoulder in the hollow wooden bellies of the gliders held their breath. The rushing wind outside began to change its pitch, softening as the pilots gently pulled back on the wooden yokes, slowing their descent. They were skimming just above the treetops now, drifting like falling leaves toward the open pastures. Hands tightened around the edges of the narrow wooden benches. A quiet, collective prayer hung in the dark, cold air, a plea for a smooth landing, for a gentle slide across the wet clover. Then, the shadows in the grass suddenly grew fangs. Hidden in the dew-soaked meadows were hundreds of heavy wooden poles, planted deep into the earth and laced with invisible, unforgiving wire. They were a trap designed to break the wings of birds just like these. The impact was not a deafening roar of fire or steel. It was a profound, tearing sound. It was the sound of heavy canvas ripping wide open, of thin plywood snapping and groaning under immense pressure. The fragile wings of the gliders struck the wooden stakes, shattering like dry twigs in a winter storm. The graceful, silent flight ended in a violent, chaotic tumble. The hollow cabins jolted violently, skidding and bouncing across the uneven earth, plowing through the damp soil and tall grass. Inside, the world became a blur of splintering wood, tearing cloth, and the heavy, breathless thuds of men being tossed against the walls. For a few terrifying seconds, they were entirely at the mercy of the breaking wood, holding their arms over their heads, eyes squeezed tightly shut, waiting for the trembling earth to finally stop moving. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the motion ceased. The rushing wind was gone. The violent shaking was over. What followed was a silence so deep, so heavy, it felt almost holy. It was a splintered silence, hanging suspended in the cold night air. Slowly, the thick dust of pulverized wood and dry earth began to settle. The moonlight poured in through the massive, ragged tears in the canvas roof, illuminating a tangled, chaotic landscape of broken beams and shattered ribs. The glider was no longer a flying machine, it was a ruined wooden skeleton resting in a foreign field. For a long moment, nobody moved. The air smelled of freshly turned soil, crushed clover, and the sharp, clean scent of split pine sap. Then, out of the shadows, came a soft, trembling groan. A shifting of weight. The rustle of a heavy wool uniform scraping against broken plywood. Is anyone there? A voice whispered. It was a young voice, shaky and thin, completely stripped of any practiced bravery. I'm here, came a gentle reply from the dark corner of the wreckage. I'm right here. Just give me a minute to find my legs. In the hushed aftermath, the true measure of these boys began to reveal itself. They were bruised, their muscles aching from the sudden stop, their minds swimming in a thick fog of bewilderment. But their first instinct was not to save themselves. Their first instinct was to reach out in the dark. Hands felt their way blindly over the jagged edges of the broken floorboards, searching for a familiar shoulder, a boot, a piece of webbing. One boy, his cheek scraped and bleeding from a splintered beam, pushed a heavy piece of canvas off his chest. He didn't check his own wound. Instead, he crawled toward the ragged breathing of the man beside him. The man was pinned beneath a piece of the broken wing spar, trapped in the twisted wreckage. Hey, the boy whispered, his hand gently finding the trapped man's face in the gloom. I've got you. I'm going to lift this up. On 3, you slide out. Okay? Okay, the trapped man breathed, his voice tight with pain, but anchored by the warmth of the hand on his cheek. With a quiet grunt of effort, the boy pushed his shoulders against the heavy beam. He felt the rough wood biting into his skin, but he closed his eyes and thought only of lifting the weight. The beam shifted just an inch, then 2. The trapped man dragged himself free, collapsing into the wet grass outside the torn fuselage. They sat together in the dew, chests heaving, leaning against the shattered side of their wooden boat, linked by a profound, unspoken gratitude. All across the dark field, amidst the scattered remains of a dozen gliders, these quiet moments of everyday heroism were blooming in the moonlight. 2 pilots, who were little more than boys themselves, carefully climbed out of the crumpled nose of their craft. They didn't look at their broken machine. They immediately turned to the cabin, peeling back the torn canvas like the petals of a ruined flower, helping their passengers step down into the tall grass. They checked arms and legs with gentle hands, whispering soft words of encouragement, their voices steady and calm despite the tremor in their own fingers. It was in these small, tender actions that the deep terror of the night began to dissolve. A young soldier, sitting quietly on a piece of broken wood, was frantically searching through his pockets. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely feel the fabric. He was looking for a letter from his wife, a letter he had kept folded against his chest for weeks. He had felt it slip away during the crash, and the thought of losing her words in this strange, dark field was breaking his heart more than the fall itself. A shadow knelt beside him in the grass. It was a boy from a different squad, someone he had barely spoken to back in the damp camps of England. The shadow reached out and gently placed a small, folded square of pale paper into his trembling hands. It blew out into the clover. The shadow whispered softly, "It's safe. You're safe." The soldier clutched the letter to his chest, closing his eyes as a single tear tracked its way through the dust on his cheek. He reached out and gripped the other boy's forearm, a silent, powerful thank you that echoed louder than any spoken word. There was no talk of the grand invasion. There was no discussion of strategy or the enemy that lay somewhere beyond the dark tree line. In this fragile bubble of time, sitting among the ruins of their wings, their world was reduced only to the men around them. They tore strips of clean cloth from the bottoms of their undershirts to wrap around sprained wrists and shallow cuts. They passed around metal canteens, the cold, metallic taste of the water serving as a beautiful, grounding reminder that they were alive. When one boy began to shiver from the shock in the cold dew, two others simply moved closer, sandwiching him between them to share their body heat, wrapping a heavy wool blanket over his trembling shoulders. They sat in the quiet dark, leaning against the skeletal ribs of the gliders that had carried them across the sea. The torn strips of canvas fluttered weakly in the gentle night breeze, making a soft, shushing sound, like a mother calming a restless child. Looking around at the scattered, broken wood, it seemed impossible that they had survived the fall. The fragile machines were completely destroyed, having sacrificed themselves against the cruel stakes to protect the cargo inside. But as the boys looked at each other in the moonlight, at the smudged faces, the tired eyes, the quiet smiles of relief, they realized that something incredibly strong had been forged in the breaking. They had fallen out of the sky as a group of frightened individuals, clinging to their private fears and personal good luck charms. But pulling each other from the wreckage, wiping the dust from a brother's eyes, and sharing the profound relief of simply breathing the cold night air, they had become something else entirely. They were bound together by the splintered wood and the damp earth. The foreign landscape around them was still deeply unknown and cloaked in shadows, but it no longer felt entirely terrifying. They were not alone in the dark. So let the shattered wood rest in the tall grass. Let the torn canvas sleep in the moonlight. The boys are sitting together now, their breathing steady, their hands quiet. They are leaning on each other, finding warmth in the chill, finding courage in the soft voices of their friends. The dawn is still miles away, and the world will soon ask much of them. But for this beautiful, suspended moment, they are simply survivors in a quiet field, holding on to the deep, unshakable comfort of brotherhood. Close your eyes, and let the gentle breeze whisper through the empty fields. You are safe in the shadows, watched over by the quiet stars, resting in the calm before the morning comes. There is a profound and heavy isolation in being tossed upon the surface of an angry sea in a box made of cold, gray steel. Long before the sky began to lighten, the vast, dark ocean was alive with the gentle, terrifying bobbing of thousands of tiny, flat-bottomed boats. They had climbed down the rough, swaying rope nets from the safety of the massive troopships, their heavy boots slipping on the wet hemp in the pitch-black night. They stepped down into these small metal cradles, descending from the world of men into the indifferent, churning kingdom of the water. Inside each boat, 30 young boys stood pressed shoulder to shoulder. The walls of the craft were high and straight, offering no view of the horizon, no glimpse of the destination. They could only look up at the bruised, tumbling clouds, or look down at the dark, sloshing water gathering at their feet. They were trapped in a floating room of cold iron, entirely at the mercy of the wind and the tide. The sea was not kind that morning. It did not welcome them. It heaved and rolled with a violent, rhythmic energy, lifting the small boats high into the freezing air before dropping them deep into the dark, hollow troughs of the waves. With every plunge, a curtain of freezing, biting spray crashed over the square bow, washing over the huddled men in a relentless, icy rain. The water seeped instantly through their heavy canvas jackets, soaking through the thick wool shirts beneath, chilling them down to the very marrow of their bones. The air was thick with the harsh, sharp scent of diesel fumes and the ancient, heavy smell of salt and seaweed. But the physical cold was only a part of the torment. Deeper than the freezing spray, deeper than the aching muscles holding on for balance, was the quiet, settling dread. It was the dread of the unknown, magnified by the complete loss of control. For boys who had grown up running across solid, sun-baked fields, or walking down paved, predictable city streets, the shifting, unstable floor beneath their feet was a profound and terrifying wrongness. They could not fight the ocean. They could only endure it. And so, to survive the cold, gray cradle, they retreated inward. They closed their eyes against the stinging salt and built quiet, beautiful sanctuaries inside their own minds. One young man, his helmet pulled low to shield his face from the wind, let his mind drift thousands of miles away to a small, warm kitchen in the Midwest. He focused entirely on the memory of his mother's hands covered in flour, kneading bread dough on a Sunday morning. He could almost feel the radiant heat of the old iron stove. He imagined the sweet, yeasty smell of the baking bread pushing away the foul, choking odor of the diesel engine. He wrapped that memory around himself like a thick, woolen blanket, letting the phantom warmth stave off the shivering in his jaw. Beside him stood a boy who had never seen the ocean before this long journey. He was incredibly sick, his face pale and drawn, his body trembling from the violent motion of the boat. He leaned heavily against the cold steel wall, his eyes squeezed shut. Without a word, the soldier next to him, a quiet, older boy from a coal mining town, shifted his stance. He braced his own legs against the rocking floor and wrapped a strong, steady arm around the sick boy's shoulders. He didn't offer empty platitudes or false promises of shore. He simply offered his strength. He became a human pillar in a tumbling world. The sick boy leaned into the rough, wet wool of the older boy's shoulder, finding an anchor in the storm. In the dark, in the cold, that simple point of contact was a lifeline. It was in these tiny, wordless exchanges that the true beauty of their spirit shone through the gloom. They could not speak. The roar of the boat's engine and the crashing of the waves swallowed any attempt at a whisper. But they found other ways to talk. They communicated through the gentle pressure of a knee leaning against a knee to help keep balance. They spoke through shared, tired glances that passed between them when the boat took a particularly violent plunge. A look that said, "I know. I am terrified too. But I am right here with you." Beneath their heavy, soaking wet jackets, tucked closest to their skin, many of the men carried small, waterproof pouches made of oiled cloth. Inside these pouches were the letters. A boy with rain dripping from his nose pressed his gloved hand flat against his chest, right over the spot where his wife's final letter rested. He couldn't read the words right now, but he didn't need to. He knew the shape of her handwriting. He knew the way she looped her letters, and the tiny, smudged fingerprint she had accidentally left in the bottom corner of the page. He pressed his hand harder against his chest, as if he could absorb her love straight through the paper, through the oilcloth, and into his racing heart. He imagined her sitting in their small living room, listening to the radio, completely unaware that he was currently floating in the dark. He sent a silent, desperate prayer out over the churning water, asking not for medals or glory, but simply for the chance to walk back through their front door and hang his hat on the peg. The boat rose again, hovering weightless for a breathless second before crashing down into the sea. The men groaned collectively, a low, quiet sound that was instantly stolen by the wind. To pass the agonizing time, some men began to silently recite the familiar comforts of their childhood. A boy from a quiet parish whispered the words of a song over and over, timing the syllables to the rise and fall of the waves. "He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters." The contrast between the beautiful, calm waters of the prayer and the violent, gray sea around him was stark, but the familiar rhythm of the words was a soothing balm to his frayed nerves. Another man softly hummed a popular dance hall tune, his lips barely moving. It was a song he had danced to on his last night on leave, holding a girl in a yellow dress. He clung to the memory of the music, letting the phantom notes drown out the sound of the engine. He let his mind waltz across a polished wooden floor, far, far away from the pitching steel floor beneath his wet boots. They were a boat full of ghosts, haunted by the beautiful, ordinary lives they had left behind. And it was these very ghosts that kept them going. As the endless hour dragged on, the pure exhaustion began to overtake the fear. The sheer physical effort of shivering, of holding on, of bracing against the constant battering of the sea, drained the adrenaline from their veins. A strange, heavy lethargy settled over the boat. The men stopped fighting the motion. They let the sea rock them. They leaned against each other in the gloom, their heads bobbing in unison with the waves. It was a terrible, freezing cradle, but it was rocking them all the same. The sky above them slowly began to change. The impenetrable, crushing blackness of the night began to thin, diluting into a bruised, melancholic purple, and then into a cold, pale gray. The dawn was coming. With the creeping light came the first faint outlines of the men around them. They looked like statues carved from wet stone. Their faces were hollowed out by the shadows, their eyes dark and distant. Yet, as the pale light touched them, small miracles of humanity emerged. A soldier reached into a relatively dry pocket deep inside his jacket and pulled out a single, crumpled piece of hard candy. It was coated in lint and slightly sticky from the damp air. He didn't eat it. He reached out and pressed it into the trembling hand of the very youngest boy in the boat, a kid who looked like he should still be sitting at a school desk. The young boy looked down at the candy, then up at the older soldier. A tiny, fragile smile broke through the grime and the seawater on his face. He popped the candy into his mouth, the sudden, sharp sweetness a brilliant spark of life in a gray world. For a moment, he wasn't a soldier heading into the unknown. He was just a kid enjoying a sweet treat. It was a profound act of grace, a reminder that even in the belly of a steel machine, surrounded by an angry ocean, they were still capable of deep, quiet tenderness. The waves continued to crash. The cold water continued to pool around their ankles. But the isolation was gone. They realized that the metal walls that trapped them also bound them together. They were breathing the same salty air. They were sharing the same freezing spray. They were all holding onto the same delicate threads of memory to keep from falling into the dark. They were brothers of the cradle now, rocked by the same heavy sea. As the gray light strengthened, the engine's roar shifted to a lower, deeper pitch. The relentless pitching and rolling began to change, taking on a different rhythm. They were nearing the shallows. The long, agonizing journey across the dark water was coming to an end. But for these last few moments, let them just be boys leaning against each other in the morning mist. Let the sea rock them gently. Let the memories of warm kitchens and summer porches hold them tight. The shore is waiting, shrouded in the fog, but right now, there is only the quiet breathing of the man beside you, the lingering taste of a shared piece of candy, and the deep, unshakable comfort of knowing you do not cross the dark water alone. Breathe in the salt air. Exhale the fear. The night is over, the sea has carried you this far, and whatever lies ahead in the mist, you will meet it together. Rest your eyes for one more second, and let the gray waves softly carry you home. The heavy iron ramp fell forward, opening a sudden, terrifying door into the pale morning mist. For the boy standing at the front of the flat-bottomed boat, the world abruptly shifted from a terrible, rocking weight into a cold and startling reality. The protective steel walls that had cradled them across the dark channel simply vanished, leaving them completely exposed to the vast, uncaring expanse of the shore. Before them lay a beach that looked nothing like the tidy, neatly drawn maps they had studied in the quiet, warm tints of England. As they stepped off the edge of the ramp, they did not meet solid earth. They met the freezing, heavy embrace of the deep ocean. The water was far higher than they had been promised. It rushed up over their heavy leather boots, over their canvas belts, rising up to their chests in a shocking, breathtaking instant. Weighted down by pounds of wet wool, heavy packs, and deep exhaustion, they suddenly found themselves fighting simply to keep their heads above the rolling gray waves. This was not a grand, sweeping charge of history. This was a slow, agonizing struggle against the pull of the tide. They waded forward, their movements heavy and dreamlike beneath the water. Every step was a profound negotiation with the shifting sand beneath their feet. When they finally broke through the surf and fell upon the shore, the reality of the beach proved far crueler than any plan could have ever anticipated. The air above them was filled with a deafening, terrifying roar, a mechanical storm that tore the morning apart and forced them flat against the unyielding earth. They pressed their faces into the wet, cold sand, their heavy breathing carving tiny, shallow craters in the ground. In that overwhelming noise, the vastness of the world disappeared. The grand strategies of generals, the carefully timed schedules, the sweeping arrows on the map, all of it dissolved into the mist. For a boy pinned against the wet shore, the entire universe shrank to the few inches of sand directly in front of his eyes. He could see the crushed white fragments of seashells. He could smell the sharp, metallic tang of the damp earth and the heavy scent of the ocean. He could feel the chaotic, trembling vibration of the ground beneath his stomach. The fear was a physical weight, pressing down on their shoulders, urging them to stay perfectly still, to hide within the shallow grooves of the beach. But the sea was not finished with them. Behind them, the tide was coming in. It moved with a quiet, relentless certainty. The freezing water began to creep up the gentle slope of the shore, washing over their boots, soaking through their knees. It was a slow, terrifying realization. They could not stay where they were. The ocean was pushing them forward, threatening to swallow the very ground they were clinging to. It was here, in this narrow, terrifying space between the rising water and the roaring storm above, that the true measure of their humanity quietly revealed itself. The heroism of the morning did not look like the paintings in history books. It did not stand tall, and it did not shout. It was found in the small, desperate, and beautiful act of reaching out. Behind a twisted barrier of dark steel, a young boy from a quiet farming town found himself completely paralyzed. The water was rising around him, pooling against his chest, but his muscles simply refused to obey. The noise and the terror had locked his limbs. He closed his eyes, his breathing shallow and fast, feeling the cold tide slowly creeping up his neck. He was adrift in his own mind, lost in the overwhelming storm. Suddenly, through the freezing water, a hand closed tightly around his wrist. It was a rough hand, calloused and covered in wet sand, wrapped in a heavy, soaked canvas sleeve. The grip was absolute. It was unyielding. The boy opened his eyes and looked up to see an older soldier, a man whose name he did not even know, lying in the shallow water beside him. The older man's face was pale and exhausted, his helmet askew, but his eyes were entirely calm. They were anchored in a profound, steady resolve. He didn't yell. He didn't give a harsh command. He simply looked at the paralyzed boy and gave his wrist a firm, gentle pull. "I have you," the older man's eyes seemed to say in the roaring silence. "You are not alone in this water. Come with me." With that single touch, the spell of terror was broken. The young boy found a sudden, desperate strength he did not know he possessed. He pushed against the sand, letting the older man pull him forward, crawling inch by agonizing inch out of the rising tide. They moved together, a pair of exhausted shadows dragging themselves out of the sea, bound by nothing but the simple, powerful warmth of another human hand. All along the gray edge of the water, these quiet miracles were happening. Men who were bruised and battered, their own strength failing, stopped to lift up brothers who could no longer walk. They draped heavy, wet arms over their own shoulders, carrying the weight of two men through the churning surf. They abandoned their heavy equipment, letting the ocean take their carefully packed bags and extra supplies, choosing instead to use their hands to hold onto each other. The tide claimed many small treasures that morning. The gentle waves washed over the sand, gently pulling away the things the boys could no longer carry. A harmonica, meant to play quiet tunes by a campfire, slipped from a pocket and sank silently into the gray depths. A photograph of a smiling girl in a summer dress, wrapped in wax paper, caught a wave and drifted out toward the open sea, a fragile white square dancing on the water. A fountain pen, bought in a small shop in London to write letters home, was buried forever beneath the shifting shells. They were shedding the heavy weights of their past, leaving their personal comforts to the sea, because the only thing that mattered now was the breathing soul beside them. Through the chaos of the shoreline, a young medic crawled through the wet sand. He carried no weapon to protect himself. He carried only a heavy canvas bag filled with bandages and a heart full of desperate, aching compassion. He moved from one huddled shadow to the next, a quiet angel in the storm. He found a boy lying in the shallows, shivering violently as the water washed over his legs. The medic knelt beside him, completely ignoring the terrible roar of the air above them. He reached into his bag with trembling fingers, pulling out a thick, white bandage. But more important than the cloth was the way he leaned down, pressing his face close to the frightened boy's ear. He spoke in a soft, steady whisper, a voice that belonged in a quiet hospital room, not on a roaring beach. He asked the boy where he was from. He asked him about his mother's cooking. He kept his voice beautifully calm, wrapping the boy not just in bandages, but in the soothing, familiar sounds of home. He held the boy's cold hand against his own chest, sharing the steady, rhythmic beating of his own heart, a gentle metronome of life in the midst of the chaos. Tears fell freely that morning, mixing silently with the salt of the sea. They were tears of profound fear, of exhausting relief, and of a deep, sorrowful love for the men beside them. A sergeant, his face covered in soot and wet sand, sat huddled behind a small rise in the beach. He looked out at the water, watching the gentle, indifferent waves rolling onto the shore. He watched his boys, the boys he had trained, the boys he had sat up with in the quiet English nights, struggling through the surf. He wept quietly, not from panic, but from an overwhelming, breaking heart. He loved them so much, and the shore was so terribly hard. He wiped his eyes with the back of his muddy hand, took a deep, shaky breath, and turned back to the sand. He reached out to the boy shivering next to him, putting a heavy, reassuring arm around his wet shoulders, pulling him close. "We are just going to rest here for a minute," the sergeant whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "Just close your eyes and breathe. I am right here. We are going to be all right." The progress was incredibly slow. It was measured in yards, sometimes only in inches. But slowly, steadily, the quiet bonds of brotherhood began to pull them out of the water. They formed small, huddled clusters of life against the gray landscape. They gathered at the edge of the shingle, a line of smooth, round stones that offered the first real sanctuary from the flat, exposed sand. They lay there in the wet stones, completely spent. Their uniforms were heavy with seawater and sand. Their hands were scraped, their muscles aching with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. But as they pressed their cheeks against the cool, smooth rocks, they found a beautiful, overwhelming relief. They had survived the water. They looked around at the faces of the men lying next to them. The smudged, tired, beautiful faces of their friends. They didn't need to speak. The shared silence between them was a thick, warm blanket. They had walked through the dark, they had crossed the angry sea, and they had faced the roaring shore. And they had done it together. The beach was behind them now, a memory of cold water and tearing wind. Ahead lay a new challenge, a steep and daunting climb. But for this one, quiet moment, they were allowed to simply exist. They were allowed to close their heavy eyelids, to feel the solid, unmoving earth beneath their tired bodies, and to listen to the sound of their own steady breathing. So rest your weary head upon the smooth stones. Let the cool mist from the ocean wash the heavy sand from your tired face. The terrible water is behind you, returning to its quiet, endless rhythm. The hands that pulled you from the tide are resting now, folded quietly in the damp grass. Breathe in the calm air. Let the profound exhaustion settle into your bones, soft and heavy. You are safe in the company of your brothers, lying quiet and still upon the shore. The hardest steps are over. Sleep softly in the gray light, and let the gentle rhythm of the sea whisper you into a peaceful, unbroken calm. A promise whispered in the dark is a fragile thing when it meets the cold, gray light of dawn. The boys lay trembling against the smooth, wet stones of the shingle, their faces pressed into the damp earth, waiting for the sky to tear open and pave their way. They had been told, in the quiet, damp tents across the sea, that they would not have to climb the towering bluffs alone. They had been promised a protective umbrella of thunder. The great, silent ships anchored in the deep water behind them were supposed to hurl a storm of iron over their heads, shattering the defenses hidden in the tall cliffs, breaking the stone into a gentle, sloping path. All they had to do was wait for the echoes. And so, they huddled together in the pale morning mist, their breathing shallow, listening for the sound of their salvation. When the deep, trembling rumble of the naval guns finally began, the very beach vibrated beneath their chests. It sounded like a massive, rolling storm trapped just beneath the surface of the ocean. The men squeezed their eyes shut, holding onto each other, bracing for the magnificent, terrifying impact that would bring the cliffs tumbling down. They heard the rushing wind of the shells, a sound like heavy silk tearing across the sky. But as they listened, the sound shifted. It did not end in a deafening, shattering crash against the bluffs right in front of them. Instead, the heavy, rushing wind soared high, far too high, arcing up into the clouds like a flock of blind, iron birds. The shells whistled harmlessly over the crest of the cliffs, sailing deep into the green countryside beyond, their impact muffled by the distance, fading into a hollow, echoing thud miles away from the beach. The boys slowly opened their eyes and looked up. The dust settled. The sea breeze blew the mist away. And the towering walls of chalk and grass stood perfectly untouched. The promised storm had passed them by entirely, leaving the cliffs silent, brooding, and impossibly steep. The quiet that followed was the heaviest thing they had ever felt. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the crushing, suffocating silence of an abandoned promise. As the realization washed over them, a deep and terrifying loneliness settled into their bones. The protective umbrella had blown away in the wind. The grand, sprawling plan of the generals, drawn with sweeping arrows on vast paper maps, had fractured here on the damp sand. They were just boys, exhausted, shivering, and entirely alone at the bottom of a massive wall. A young soldier, who had spent his entire life in a flat, sweeping valley, stared up at the sheer face of the bluff. He had never seen anything so tall, so impossibly unyielding. He felt a cold knot of despair tighten in his throat. He had survived the dark wait in England, he had survived the terrifying fall through the night sky, and he had survived the freezing, pulling tide. But looking at that unbroken wall of stone, he felt the very last drops of his courage beginning to drain away into the sand. He reached into the deep pocket of his wet canvas jacket, his fingers numb and clumsy. He bypassed his spare ammunition and found what he was looking for, a small, smooth river stone his grandfather had given him before he boarded the train. He closed his fist around it, holding it so tightly his knuckles turned white. He closed his eyes and tried to picture his grandfather's face, searching desperately for a source of strength outside of himself. But there was no one coming to lift him up. The ships were too far away. The airplanes were gone. There was only the stone in his pocket, the wet sand beneath his knees, and the immense, terrifying climb ahead. Beside him lay an older man, a man who had been a baker before the world asked him to be a soldier. His face was lined with deep exhaustion, his uniform heavy with seawater and dark mud. He saw the young boy staring at the cliff, saw the trembling in the boy's shoulders, and recognized the hollow, sinking look of absolute despair. The baker did not shout. He did not issue a harsh, demanding order. He simply shifted his weight on the whetstones, reached out a heavy, mud-caked hand, and rested it gently on the young boy's shoulder. "Well," the older man whispered, his voice a soft, scratchy rasp that barely carried over the sound of the gentle waves behind them. "It looks like the front door is locked. I suppose we'll just have to take the stairs." It was a small, ridiculous thing to say. But in that crushing, terrible silence, it was a tiny spark of light. The young boy looked away from the imposing cliffs and turned to the older man. He saw the soft, weary smile forming at the edges of the baker's mouth. He saw the quiet, unshakable resolve resting deep within the older man's tired eyes. And in that shared, quiet glance, the spell of despair was broken. The protective shells from the sea had failed them, yes. But they suddenly realized that true salvation does not come falling from the sky. It does not come from grand machines or distant plans. It comes from the quiet, burning strength hidden within their own exhausted hearts. It comes from the man lying next to you in the mud, choosing to smile when there is absolutely nothing left to smile about. All along the shingle, this quiet shift was happening. The fear did not vanish, it remained, a cold and constant companion, but it was no longer a paralyzing weight. It transformed into a slow, stubborn energy. Men who thought they could not take another step began to slowly push themselves up from the damp earth. They moved with a beautiful, tragic grace, their limbs heavy and aching, their breath pluming in the cool morning air. Two friends from the same noisy city block, boys who had shared whispered secrets in the dark holds of the ships, knelt facing each other in the shingle. One of them had lost his helmet in the surf, his dark hair was plastered to his forehead, dripping salt water into his eyes. The other friend carefully reached into his own pack, pulling out a torn strip of dry olive-drab cloth. Without a word, he gently wiped the stinging salt from his friend's face, treating him with the delicate care one might give to a child. Then, he took a short length of thin rope and tied one end firmly to his own heavy canvas belt, and tied the other end to his friend's. It was a simple, profound tether. It was a physical promise made in the shadow of the imposing wall. If you slip, I will catch you. If I fall, you will hold me. We will not climb this mountain alone. They stood up together, leaning on each other's shoulders for balance, their eyes fixed not on the terrifying height of the bluff, but only on the first few feet of the slope directly in front of them. The grand illusion of an easy path had washed away with the tide. The reality they faced was incredibly hard and incredibly steep. But as they gathered their heavy, soaked gear, there was a profound peace settling over them. The agonizing torment of waiting for someone else to save them was over. They looked down the line of the beach, seeing hundreds of other small, shivering shadows slowly rising from the stones. They were a fragile, broken line of boys, battered by the sea and abandoned by the thunder. Yet, they were standing. They checked their boots, planting them firmly into the soft, shifting sand at the base of the incline. They checked the buckles of their packs, ensuring the weight was balanced. They moved with a slow, deliberate care, conserving every tiny drop of energy left in their aching bodies. A young medic, his white armband stained dark with the sea, paused at the base of the hill. He looked back at the ocean one last time. The gray waves were rolling in, gentle and indifferent, washing away their footprints in the sand. He thought of a letter he had written to his sister, tucked safely in a waterproof bag deep in his pack. He had told her that he was just a small drop in a vast ocean, easily lost in the storm. But looking around at the men beginning their slow, painful ascent, he realized he was wrong. They were not just drops of water tossed by the wind. They were the tide itself. Slow, quiet, and absolutely unstoppable. He took a deep breath of the sharp, salty air, turned his back to the water, and took his first step up the incline. The echoes of the great guns had faded completely now, swallowed by the vastness of the morning. The air was filled only with the intimate, deeply human sounds of struggle and quiet perseverance. The soft sliding of loose gravel beneath heavy boots. The heavy, rhythmic sound of deep breathing. the gentle clinking of a metal canteen against a brass buckle. And underneath it all, a quiet, reassuring murmur passing between the men as they began to climb. Step here. The ground is softer. Take my hand. I've got a good hold. Just one more yard. Just one more. They were building their own protective umbrella, not out of iron and explosives, but out of shared breath, quiet encouragement, and the refusal to leave a brother behind. They were pulling each other up from the shadows, step by agonizing step, carrying the weight of the world on shoulders that were so very tired and so very young. So let the distant thunder fade into the valleys. Let the grand ships rest on the quiet water. The boys on the shore do not need the sky to fall for them anymore. They have found the quiet strength burning within their own chests. Watch them as they rise from the mist, shadows moving slowly up the ancient stone. Let their steady breathing be your lullaby. The climb is long, the path is steep, but they are moving forward, guided by the gentle, unwavering light of their own quiet courage. Rest your eyes, and let them climb in peace, knowing that the strength they need was inside them all along. Even the heaviest of iron cannot break the will of a restless sea. Long before the sun had a chance to warm the bruised and weeping sky, a quiet hope was waiting in the deep water, far off the coast of the gray beach. The boys shivering in the damp, flat-bottomed boats had been promised a shield. They had been told that they would not have to walk onto the open sand alone. Waiting for them, hidden in the churning waves, would be great beasts of protective steel, rising from the ocean like ancient guardians to stand between their fragile bodies and the storm waiting on the shore. These were the floating tanks. They were a beautiful, desperate illusion. Heavy, unyielding machines of war wrapped in delicate skirts of waterproof canvas, held up by nothing more than trapped air and the profound optimism of the men who drove them. Inside the dark, cramped bellies of these steel machines, the crews waited in the gloom. It was a world of cold metal, smelling sharply of thick grease, diesel fuel, and the damp wool of their own uniforms. To the young men who lived inside them, these tanks were not just weapons, they were homes. They had spent countless hours in the quiet English woods polishing the brass dials, sweeping the iron floorboards, and painting the names of their sweethearts in bright, hopeful letters across the steel siding. A young driver, his hands resting lightly on the cold steering levers, gently hummed a tune to the vibrations of the idling engine. In his breast pocket, safe in a waxed paper sleeve, was a photograph of a girl standing by a white picket fence. He drew comfort from the thick armor surrounding him. He believed, with all the innocent faith of youth, that this iron shell would carry him safely through the dark water and deliver him to the solid earth. But the ocean is an ancient, untamed thing, and it does not care for the clever inventions of men. As the landing crafts lowered their heavy ramps into the freezing, rolling sea, the illusion began to unravel. The water was not the calm, glassy mirror they had practiced on in the sheltered bays back home. It was a chaotic, heaving landscape of deep troughs and towering, white-capped waves. One by one, the heavy iron machines rolled off the ramps and slipped down into the churning gray. For a fleeting, breathless moment, the magic held. The canvas skirts billowed and stretched, catching the air, and the massive tanks bobbed to the surface, looking like strange, cumbersome boats. The crews inside breathed a collective, trembling sigh of relief. Through their small, salt-streaked periscopes, they looked toward the distant, hazy line of the shore. They began their slow, rhythmic crawl through the water, their engines humming a low, steady lullaby against the roar of the sea. But the waves were too high, and the wind was too cruel. The delicate canvas walls, designed for gentle ripples, groaned and shuddered against the violent pushing of the tide. The sea began to crest over the top of the fabric screens, pouring down into the hollow spaces. At first, it was just a cold spray, a gentle warning from the deep. But soon, the freezing water began to cascade over the canvas edges in heavy, relentless sheets. Inside the iron belly, the reality of the ocean crept in. The cold water pooled around the heavy leather boots of the crew. It rose to their ankles, then to their knees, carrying with it the undeniable, sinking weight of truth. There was no sudden explosion. There was no fiery drama. The loss of their protection was a quiet, heartbreaking surrender to the laws of nature. The ocean was simply opening its arms, gently claiming the heavy iron and pulling it down into the dark. The commander of one sinking tank, a quiet man with kind, tired eyes, looked down at the rising water. He felt the heavy machine beneath him growing sluggish, losing its fight against the deep. He looked at his boys, his young, frightened crew, their eyes wide in the dim light. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He reached out and placed a steady, reassuring hand on the young driver's shoulder. "All right, boys," he whispered, his voice calm and incredibly soft over the sound of the rushing water. "She's tired. We have to let her go." It was an order of profound, loving grace. They moved quickly, but with a strange, dreamlike calm. They abandoned their posts, leaving behind their extra rations, their spare boots, and the heavy metal home that had kept them safe for so long. They climbed up through the narrow steel hatches, bursting out into the freezing, salt-laden wind just as the ocean swallowed the last inches of the canvas skirt. They threw themselves into the churning sea, plunging into the shocking, breathless cold. Behind them, the iron machine did not struggle. With a quiet, heavy sigh of escaping air, it slipped beneath the waves. The painted name of the sweetheart vanished into the dark, blue depths, sinking slowly and peacefully down to the quiet, sandy floor of the ocean, where it would rest forever in the silent dark. To find yourself suddenly adrift in the vast, freezing ocean, stripped of your armor and your purpose, is a terrifying vulnerability. The tank crews, trained to fight from behind impenetrable steel, were now nothing more than fragile boys wrapped in heavy, soaking wool, treading water in the middle of a storm. The shore was a distant, misty dream, miles away across the rolling peaks of the waves. The cold was an immediate, physical weight, stealing the breath from their lungs and the strength from their arms. To survive, they had to shed the very things that made them soldiers. They unbuckled their heavy webbed belts, letting their canteens and tools sink into the abyss. They kicked off their thick, waterlogged boots, sacrificing their protection for the precious gift of buoyancy. They became beautifully, terribly human, reduced to nothing but beating hearts and reaching hands. In the rolling swell of the ocean, the quiet heroism of the morning unfolded in the freezing water. The young driver, shivering violently, felt his heavy wool jacket pulling him under. Panic fluttered in his chest like a trapped bird. He kicked his numb legs, gasping for air as a wave washed over his head. But before he could slip beneath the surface, a strong arm wrapped securely under his chin. It was his commander. The older man was treading water beside him, his face pale with cold but his eyes burning with an unshakable, stubborn love. "Just lean back," the commander whispered, coughing up a mouthful of seawater. "I've got you. Look at the clouds. Just look at the clouds and breathe." He held the young boy up, spending his own rapidly fading energy to keep his friend's face above the water. They drifted together, a tiny island of humanity in the vast, uncaring sea. They didn't speak of the war. They didn't speak of the shore. The commander simply hummed a soft, rhythmic tune, a gentle vibration against the young boy's shoulder, a lullaby to keep the terrifying sleep of the ocean at bay. All around them, scattered across the gray water, similar miracles were happening. Crews who had escaped their sinking machines swam toward each other, linking their freezing hands to form small, floating circles of warmth. They shared the single, rubber life preservers they had managed to inflate, taking turns resting their weary chins on the inflated rings. When one boy's eyes began to close, overcome by the numbing cold, the others would gently splash his face, speaking to him in soft, encouraging tones, reminding him of his mother's kitchen, of the warm sun on a summer porch, of the life that was still waiting for him back home. They were bound together by a profound, haunting sense of loss. They had lost their mighty machines, the iron guardians they had trusted to save the day. But in the freezing water, they found something infinitely more valuable. They found the unyielding strength of their brotherhood. The swim to the shore was an agonizing, timeless eternity. The tide pulled at them, the waves battered them, but they moved forward with a slow, quiet resilience. They swam for the boys they knew were waiting on the beach, the boys who were expecting a shield that would never arrive. When their bare, numb feet finally brushed against the soft, shifting sand of the shallows, they had no strength left to stand. They let the gentle waves wash them onto the shoreline, crawling out of the surf on their hands and knees like exhausted survivors of a forgotten shipwreck. They collapsed onto the wet stones of the shingle, pressing their shivering bodies against the solid, unmoving earth. The air was filled with the terrible roar of the morning, but all they could hear was the beautiful, miraculous sound of their own ragged breathing. The infantry boys, huddled behind the small rises in the sand, looked back at the surf, waiting for the heavy rumble of the tanks. Instead, they saw only these shivering, barefoot ghosts pulling themselves from the tide. They saw the tank crews, stripped of their iron, carrying absolutely nothing but their lives. There was a moment of profound, heartbreaking understanding. The protective shield was gone. The heavy steel lay sleeping in the deep. But as an infantry soldier reached out a trembling hand to pull a shivering tank driver up from the wet sand, wrapping a damp wool blanket around his shoulders, the truth of the morning settled over them. The iron had sunk, but the boys had survived. The machines had failed, but the human spirit, fragile and soft and easily bruised, had proven completely unbreakable. They had lost their armor, but they had not lost each other. So let the heavy steel rest peacefully in the dark, quiet depths of the sea. Let the ocean cradle the machines in its cool, silent embrace. The boys who drove them are safe on the shore now, wrapped in the warmth of their brothers' arms. The wind is cold, and the beach is unforgiving, but they are breathing the sharp morning air. They have crossed the terrifying deep, and they have carried the only thing that truly mattered all the way to the sand. Close your eyes, listen to the gentle wash of the waves, and know that the greatest strength does not lie in walls of iron, but in the quiet, reaching hand of a friend in the dark. To stand at the bottom of a towering wall of wet stone is to feel the absolute fragility of being human. The narrow strip of shingle had offered them a fleeting sanctuary, a quiet place to catch their breath after the terrifying pull of the tide. But as the boys huddled on the smooth, damp stones, shivering in their heavy, soaked wool, they finally tilted their tired faces upward. Through the thinning morning mist, the true weight of their journey revealed itself. Rising from the narrow beach, cutting straight up into the low-hanging gray clouds, was a sheer, unyielding face of ancient rock. It looked like the edge of the world. It was a massive, silent fortress carved by centuries of wind and sea, scarred by deep crevices and slick with the cold, relentless morning rain. For young men who had already endured the dark wait in the damp forests, the terrifying fall through the night sky, and the freezing, breathless struggle of the ocean, this wall of stone seemed impossible. They were already completely exhausted. Their muscles burned with a deep, consuming ache. Their hands were numb from the cold, and their boots were heavy with wet sand and seawater. They had nothing left to give. But as they stared up at the sheer drop, a quiet, beautiful truth settled over them. They were not going to climb this cliff for glory. They were not going to climb it to be heroes in a storybook. They were going to climb it simply because the boy standing next to them was going to climb it. Out of the mist, heavy iron grappling hooks were launched upward, carrying thin, fragile lifelines into the clouds. The ropes fell back down the face of the cliff, unspooling like slender spiderwebs against the gray stone. They were humble things, these ropes. They were made of simple, twisted hemp, quickly darkened and made heavy by the falling rain. The boys stepped up to the base of the rock. A young man from a sweeping, flat valley, who had never seen a mountain in his entire life, reached out and closed his trembling fingers around the wet rope. The rough fibers bit into his cold skin. He closed his eyes, took a slow, deep breath of the sharp, salty air, and pulled himself off the solid earth. To climb a sheer cliff in the freezing rain is a slow, agonizing meditation. It is a dialogue between the heavy, pulling gravity of the earth and the fragile, stubborn will of the human heart. The stone was terribly unforgiving. It offered no easy paths. The small, shallow handholds were slick with green moss and wet chalk, crumbling beneath their searching fingers. Their heavy leather boots scraped and slipped against the smooth rock, struggling to find a purchase in the sheer vertical drop. With every inch they gained, the muscles in their arms screamed in protest, begging them to simply let go, to slide back down to the safety of the flat beach. But they did not let go. Because attached to the same thin, fraying rope, just a few feet below, was a brother. If one boy stopped climbing, the boy beneath him could not move. If one boy slipped, his weight would fall upon the exhausted shoulders of his friend. And so, they climbed out of a profound, desperate devotion to each other. They became links in a living chain, suspended in the mist, bound together by wet hemp and quiet love. The silence on the cliff face was heavy and intimate. The roar of the beach below faded into a distant, muffled wash of sound. Up here, wrapped in the cold clouds, there was only the rhythmic, scraping sound of boots on stone, the soft, squishing noise of wet ropes twisting under tension, and the ragged, heavy breathing of the boys. In the middle of the climb, a young soldier's foot slipped on a patch of wet moss. He dropped entirely, his full weight jarring against his arms, his raw fingers burning as they slid down the rough rope. Panic flared in his chest, a sudden, bright terror. He dangled in the mist, his boots swinging over empty air, his strength rapidly fading. From just above him, a hand reached down. It was not grabbing for the rope, it was reaching for him. The boy above, his own arms shaking with exhaustion, wrapped his thick, mud-caked fingers firmly around the canvas suspenders of the dangling soldier. He braced his boots against a narrow crack in the stone, pressing his face against the cold rock, and pulled. "I have you," a voice whispered down through the rain. It was a soft, strained whisper, lacking the breath for anything louder, but it carried the absolute certainty of a vow. "Just find the rock. Find the rock. I have your weight." The dangling boy closed his eyes, fighting back tears of exhaustion, and blindly kicked his boot against the cliff until the toe caught a tiny edge of stone. He pushed up, taking the weight off his burning hands, and pressed his forehead against the wet rock, sobbing quietly in the mist. The hand on his suspenders gave a gentle, reassuring pat before letting go. "Take a breath," the voice above whispered softly. "We'll stay right here for a minute. Just breathe." Hanging there in the gray void, resting on tiny ledges of stone, the boys retreated into the warm, quiet spaces of their own minds to find the strength for the next pull. One soldier, his cheek pressed against the freezing, jagged rock, closed his eyes and thought of a small, sunlit room back home. He focused entirely on the memory of his younger sister sitting at the piano. He remembered the soft, warm light filtering through the lace curtains, the smell of lemon polish on the wood, and the gentle, lilting melody she used to play on Sunday afternoons. He timed his breathing to the phantom notes of that piano. With every imagined chord, he reached his hand up. With every gentle pause in the music, he pulled himself higher. He let the beauty of that safe, quiet room push the cold reality of the cliff away. Another man kept his mind fixed on a folded piece of paper tucked deep inside his waterproof jacket. It was a letter from his father, a man of few words who had simply written, "I am proud of the man you are." The soldier imagined those words glowing with a warm, golden light against his chest, a tiny hearth fire burning beneath his wet wool shirt. He climbed to honor that quiet pride. He climbed to be the man his father saw in him. As they neared the top, the mist began to thin. The air grew colder, but it carried a new, faint scent. Mixed with the sharp smell of the sea and the ozone of the rain, there was the sweet, earthy fragrance of crushed grass and wild thyme. The crest of the cliff was near. The final heave over the edge was the hardest. Their bodies were completely spent, trembling violently from the sustained effort and the biting cold. They threw their arms over the muddy lip of the cliff, digging their bruised, bleeding fingers deep into the soft, wet earth, and dragged their heavy legs over the stone. They collapsed into the tall, dew-soaked grass, rolling onto their backs, their chests heaving, their eyes wide and staring up at the pale morning sky. They lay there in the quiet, expecting the world to tear apart. They had climbed this impossible wall because they were told that a terrible storm of fire and iron was waiting for them at the top. They had pushed themselves beyond the absolute limits of human endurance to meet a fearsome enemy hiding in the concrete shadows. But as their breathing slowly began to steady, they realized the profound, beautiful truth of the morning. The crest was empty. The sweeping fields of tall grass were quiet, swaying gently in the cool breeze. The massive, threatening craters that had scarred the earth were silent. The terrible, heavy guns they had climbed so high to silence were nowhere to be found. Some had been moved away in the dark, others were simply clever illusions, harmless logs carved to look like iron from a distance. There was no enemy waiting to cast them back into the sea. There was only the rustling wind, the soft falling rain, and the vast, peaceful expanse of the green countryside. A profound, echoing sense of relief washed over them, so heavy and sweet it brought fresh tears to their tired eyes. They had not climbed into a nightmare. They had climbed into the quiet morning. A sergeant, his face smeared with chalk and dark mud, sat up slowly in the grass. He looked down the line of the cliff edge, watching his boys pulling themselves over the top one by one. He watched them collapse into the clover, shivering and gasping, but whole. He saw two boys lying side by side, too exhausted to speak, simply reaching out to gently hold each other's hand in the wet grass. They had fought gravity. They had fought the unforgiving stone. They had fought their own deep, internal terrors. And they had won. The cliff had tested them, trying to break their bodies and their spirits, but it had only proven how unbreakable their bonds truly were. They had carried each other up a mountain, not with heavy armor or grand weapons, but with quiet whispers, gentle hands, and a profound, enduring love for the brother on the rope. So let the ropes hang quiet against the gray stone. Let the rain wash the chalk from their bruised and weary hands. The boys are safe at the top of the world now, resting in the soft, sweet-smelling grass. They do not need to fight today. They only need to breathe. They only need to feel the solid, flat earth beneath their backs and know that the hardest climb is over. The sky is lightening, the mist is clearing, and they are together, unbroken and beautifully alive. Rest your aching muscles in the clover. Let the gentle wind dry your face. You have conquered the stone, and the quiet, peaceful morning belongs to you. Sleep softly, and let the world be still. To survive the vast and angry ocean, only to find yourself trapped upon the very edge of the shore, is a quiet, suffocating kind of heartbreak. The boys had fought their way through the freezing surf, dragging their heavy, waterlogged boots across the unforgiving expanse of the beach. They had reached the base of the bluffs, seeking the narrow, winding paths that led up and away from the sea. These were the only doorways off the sand, small, sandy draws carved by ancient rainwater, cutting through the high chalk cliffs. But as they pressed forward, hoping to finally leave the cold wind of the channel behind them, they found these doorways completely, hopelessly blocked. The narrow exits had become choked with a tangled, chaotic web of desperate men and broken machines. Heavy metal engines, completely exhausted by the sea and the sand, had stalled right in the middle of the narrow passages. Wagons with shattered wooden wheels sat awkwardly tilted in the mud, their canvas covers torn and blowing weakly in the breeze. And behind these lifeless obstacles, hundreds of shivering, exhausted boys were backed up, pressed tightly shoulder to shoulder. They were caught in the neck of a terrible hourglass. The beach behind them was shrinking as the morning tide began its slow, inevitable creep forward, and the path ahead was completely sealed. They were stalled, unable to move forward, unable to go back, pinned in a claustrophobic crush of wet wool, heavy canvas, and deep, aching exhaustion. To be stalled in a place of danger is to feel a profound, terrifying helplessness. The adrenaline that had carried them through the water began to curdle into a rising, breathless panic. In the middle of the crowd, pressed against the cold steel of a broken machine, a young boy closed his eyes and tried to breathe. The air was thick with the smell of burning oil, damp earth, and the nervous sweat of the men around him. He felt completely crushed, swallowed by the sheer mass of humanity. His heart hammered wildly against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He had grown up on a sweeping, wide-open farm, a place where you could look to the horizon and see nothing but endless fields of green wheat. He had never liked small spaces. And now, surrounded by the towering cliffs and the press of heavy coats, he felt he could not draw enough air into his lungs. He reached a trembling hand into his jacket and pressed it flat against his chest, right over a letter from his mother. He didn't pull it out to read it, he just needed to touch the paper. He closed his eyes tighter and imagined he was back on his front porch. He pictured the vast, unbroken blue sky of his childhood. He imagined the way the wind would sweep through the tall grass, making a soft, shushing sound that went on forever. He focused entirely on that memory of open space, drawing the phantom wind into his lungs, using the quiet peace of his home to push the terrifying crush of the beach away. Beside him, another soldier noticed the young boy's ragged breathing. This soldier was older, a quiet man who had worked as a watchmaker in a quiet city before the world changed. He understood the delicate, fragile workings of things, and he recognized the look of a boy whose gears were beginning to slip. The watchmaker didn't say a word. He simply shifted his weight, bracing his back against the broken machine, and placed his own body between the young boy and the pressing crowd. He created a tiny, invisible bubble of space, just an inch or two of room, shielding the boy from the crushing weight of the standstill. He reached out and gently tapped the boy's helmet, offering a slow, reassuring nod. A silent promise that said, "Take your time. I will hold the world back for a minute. Just breathe." All through the tangled bottleneck, these small, unseen acts of everyday heroism were holding the fragile line of sanity together. Men who were bruised and bleeding, their own strength completely spent, offered their canteens to strangers. When a heavy canvas bag slipped from a tired shoulder and fell into the mud, 3 different pairs of hands reached down to pick it up, carefully wiping the dirt from the fabric before handing it back to its owner. They were treating each other with a profound, delicate courtesy, a gentle politeness that seemed completely out of place on a roaring beach, yet was absolutely necessary for their survival. But the line was still not moving. The tangled knot of men and metal seemed impossibly stalled. The fear began to ripple through the crowd again, a cold shiver passing from shoulder to shoulder. And then, out of the chaotic standstill, a voice arose. It was not a booming shout. It was not a harsh, barking command. It was a voice perfectly measured, deep and remarkably calm. It sounded like a father soothing a frightened child in the middle of a thunderstorm. "All right, boys," the voice drifted over the heads of the huddled men. "Let's untangle this knot. Nice and slow. Nobody is being left behind." The voice belonged to a sergeant, a man with dust in his hair and deep exhaustion carved lines around his gentle eyes. He did not stand on a crate and wave a weapon. He stepped directly into the thickest part of the jam, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. He walked right up to the stalled, smoking machine that was blocking the path. He didn't yell at the machine, and he didn't yell at the boys hiding behind it. He simply patted the cold metal hood, as one might calm a tired horse, and then turned to the shivering soldiers. "She's done all she can for us," the sergeant whispered softly, offering a warm, tired smile. "Let's give her a push, shall we? Just clear her off the path." The simple, clear instruction cut through the fog of their panic. It gave them a purpose. 10 boys, their hands numb and their muscles screaming, stepped forward. They placed their wet, sandy palms against the heavy iron of the machine. The sergeant stood shoulder to shoulder with them, his hands pressing against the metal alongside theirs. "On my breath," he said quietly. 1, 2, push gently." With a collective groan, a sound of profound human effort, they pushed. Their boots slipped in the mud, but they held each other up. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy machine began to roll. It shifted to the side, its tires sinking deep into the soft sand off the path, finally coming to rest against the base of the bluff. A gap opened. A narrow, beautiful sliver of empty space leading up the hill. A collective sigh washed over the crowd. The terrifying, invisible wall had been breached. But the sergeant knew that the sudden opening could cause a dangerous rush, a panicked surge that would only create a new knot. He stood in the center of the newly opened path and raised his hands, palms facing outward in a gesture of absolute peace. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice a steady, rhythmic metronome. "One step at a time. We have all the time in the world. Walk like you're walking down the aisle of a quiet church. Soft and steady." He reached out and took the hand of the nearest boy, a kid whose eyes were wide with residual fear, and gently guided him past the broken machine. "Go on up, son. The grass is waiting for you." He became a quiet conductor, untangling the fear one soul at a time. He directed the flow of the men with gentle touches to the shoulder, soft nods of encouragement, and a continuous stream of soothing words. When he saw a boy carrying too much weight, he would gently unbuckle one of the heavy bags and sling it over his own tired shoulder, lightening the load without making a fuss. The boys began to move. They formed a slow, single-file line, moving up the narrow draw. They looked like a line of weary pilgrims climbing a sacred hill. To keep from stumbling in the thick mud, they instinctively reached out, each boy lightly holding onto the heavy canvas belt of the man walking directly in front of him. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking sight. Hundreds of young men, battered by the ocean and exhausted by the sand, linked together like a chain of fragile paper dolls. They were trusting the man ahead of them to find the footing, and they were providing an anchor for the man behind them. As they walked, the sound of the beach began to fade. The crushing, claustrophobic feeling of the sand dissolved, replaced by the deep, earthy smell of the ancient bluffs. They could feel the ground changing beneath their boots. The shifting, unpredictable sand slowly gave way to firm, solid dirt, woven tightly with the roots of scrub brush and wild coastal grass. It was the feeling of leaving a nightmare and stepping back into the real, waking world. The boy who had missed the wide-open spaces of his farm felt the earth harden beneath his feet. He looked up, past the shoulders of the men in front of him, and saw the crest of the hill. He saw a patch of pale, gray morning sky. He took a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs not with the smell of burning oil, but with the clean, sharp scent of the rain-washed countryside. He squeezed the belt of the man in front of him, a silent thank you to the universe, and kept walking. The watchmaker, walking a few paces behind, watched the young boy's shoulders drop, the tension finally leaving his frame. The watchmaker smiled a quiet, secret smile. The delicate gears of the boy's heart had caught again. They were ticking smoothly. Slowly, steadily, the choking grain of sand was washed away. The tangled web was beautifully, carefully unraveled by the simple power of a calm voice and the reaching hand of a brother. They did not conquer the bottleneck with force, they dissolved it with patience, with grace, and with an unshakable devotion to each other. As the last few boys stepped past the broken machines and began their climb, the narrow draw fell quiet. The heavy metal husks sat silently in the mud, monuments to the struggle that had just passed. The beach was finally behind them. The terrible, suffocating weight of the sand had released its grip. They were moving upward, away from the sea, guided by the gentle, steady presence of the men beside them. So let your weary feet find the solid earth. Let the heavy burden of the sand fall away from your shoulders. The path ahead is clear, winding softly up into the quiet, green hills. The frantic crush is over. You are walking in a steady, unbroken line, anchored by the hands of your friends, moving slowly and beautifully toward the safety of the morning. Breathe in the cool, sweet air of the grass. The hardest steps have been taken. Close your eyes, let the rhythm of the slow march soothe your tired bones, and know that you are moving forward, perfectly safe, and perfectly together. To leave the wide, roaring ocean and step into a world made entirely of shadows and leaves is to walk into a quiet, breathless dream. As the exhausted young men finally pulled themselves up over the crests of the bluffs, leaving the cold, gray shingle and the endless, churning water behind, they expected to find the wide, sweeping fields they had been promised. The maps they had studied in the warm, damp tints of England had shown neat, geometric squares, simple lines drawn in pencil to represent the quiet farming country of the Norman coast. But maps, drawn from high above the clouds, cannot capture the feeling of the earth. They cannot show you the shadows, and they cannot prepare you for the profound, heavy silence of an ancient world. What the boys found at the top of the cliffs was not an open pasture, but a towering, impossible maze. It was a green labyrinth, built of massive walls of thick earth, densely packed with centuries of twisted roots, thorny brambles, and towering oak trees. These were the hedgerows. They were not simple bushes, but ancient, earthen fortresses, carved by generations of forgotten farmers, creating a vast, disorienting puzzle of sunken lanes and hidden corridors. Stepping into the labyrinth was like crossing the threshold of a massive, quiet cathedral made entirely of living things. The roaring mechanical storm of the beach was instantly swallowed by the thick vegetation. The terrifying noise of the surf was replaced by a profound, heavy stillness. The air here was entirely different. It no longer smelled of sharp salt and cold iron. It smelled of rich, dark soil, of crushed ivy, of damp moss, and the sweet, decaying perfume of old, fallen leaves. The light, too, completely changed. The wide, flat sky was hidden behind a thick canopy of interlocking branches. The bright morning sun was filtered through millions of trembling green leaves, transforming the light into a soft, dappled emerald glow that danced slowly across the muddy paths. It was a beautiful place, but to a boy carrying a heavy canvas pack and a heart full of fear, it was deeply, incredibly isolating. In the open water, they had been terrified, but they had been together. They could see the long line of their brothers stretching out along the sand. But inside the green labyrinth, the world shrank until it was no wider than a country lane. A soldier could be standing just 10 feet away from his closest friend, separated only by a wall of thick hawthorn and twisted roots, and feel completely, utterly alone in the universe. They moved step by careful step, lifting their heavy, waterlogged boots and placing them softly into the mud, terrified of breaking the silence. Every snap of a dry twig sounded like a thunderclap in the hush of the sunken lanes. Every rustle of a bird taking flight from the canopy sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through their exhausted chests. One young man, who had grown up beneath the vast, unbroken skies of the western plains, found himself trembling as he walked down a narrow, shadowy tunnel of foliage. He was a boy who needed to see the horizon to feel safe. Here, the walls of earth rose high above his helmet, leaning inward, threatening to swallow him whole. The claustrophobia was a physical weight, pressing against his ribs, making his breath come in short, shallow gasps. He stopped walking. He closed his eyes and pressed his bare, trembling hand against the ancient dirt of the hedgerow wall. He felt the rough, damp texture of the soil. He felt the cool, velvety softness of a patch of bright green moss. He let his fingers trace the hard, knotted surface of an oak root that had been growing there since before his grandfather was born. And in that simple, tactile connection with the earth, his panic began to slowly recede. He realized that this ancient wall was not trying to crush him. It was simply existing, completely indifferent to the chaos of the world. It was solid. It was real. He took a slow, deep breath of the damp air, feeling his heart rate steady to the quiet rhythm of the forest. As the morning stretched on, the boys began to realize a beautiful, unexpected truth about the green labyrinth. The walls that isolated them also protected them. The high banks of earth completely blocked the cold, biting wind rolling off the ocean. The thick canopy hid them from the eyes of the sky. The sunken lanes, though terrifying in their narrowness, offered a profound, sheltering embrace. They were like deep trenches woven by nature herself, offering a quiet place to hide, to breathe, and to finally rest their aching legs. Small groups of men, sometimes just 2 or 3 boys who had stumbled into each other in the leafy gloam, began to stop. They found small, natural hollows carved into the base of the earth walls, little caves made of roots and ferns. They slumped down into the soft, wet leaves, their backs resting against the solid dirt. They took off their heavy steel helmets, letting the cool, damp air touch their sweaty hair. They unbuckled their stiff canvas webbing, letting the terrible weight slide from their bruised shoulders. It was in these tiny, hidden alcoves of the labyrinth that the most profound moments of everyday humanity began to unfold. A soldier, his face smeared with soot and dried seawater, reached into the bottom of his canvas pack with tired, shaking fingers. He pulled out a small, olive-drab tin. It was a simple combat ration, a meager offering of preserved food. But in the middle of a frightening, alien maze, it was a treasure beyond measure. He sat shoulder to shoulder with a boy he had met only yesterday on the swaying deck of a transport ship. Without saying a word, he pulled a small, metal key from the bottom of the tin and began to turn it. The soft, metallic snick-snick-snick of the tin opening was the loudest sound in their quiet corner of the world. It was a deeply domestic, comforting sound, a sound that belonged in a warm kitchen, not a dark forest. He peeled back the lid to reveal a handful of pale, preserved peaches swimming in golden syrup. He didn't eat. He simply held the tin out to the boy sitting beside him. The boy looked at the tin, then up at his friend. His eyes were wide, shining with a quiet, overwhelming gratitude. He reached out with a dirty, scraped finger, picked up a single slice of the fruit, and placed it in his mouth. The sharp, incredibly bright sweetness of the sugar was a shock to his senses. After hours of tasting only bitter salt, fear, and cold rain, the simple taste of a peach felt like a tiny, brilliant sunrise inside his mind. It tasted of lazy summer afternoons. It tasted of peace. He closed his eyes and let his head fall back against the roots, chewing slowly, savoring every single drop of the syrup. Then, he took the tin and held it back out to his friend. They passed the small metal can back and forth in the dappled light, sharing the quiet communion of a meal, finding a profound, warming comfort in the simple act of eating together in the dirt. When the tin was empty, the boy who had brought it used his finger to wipe the last drops of sticky syrup from the bottom, offering it to a stray ant crawling across a broad green leaf. It was a tiny, beautiful gesture of gentleness in a world that had asked him to be hard. A few yards down the sunken lane, hidden behind a thick curtain of weeping willow branches, an older soldier sat with his knees pulled tightly to his chest. A single, golden beam of sunlight had managed to pierce the thick canopy, falling like a spotlight onto the moss beside him. He reached into his breast pocket and carefully unfolded a piece of pale blue paper. It was a letter from his wife, worn soft as fabric from being read 100 times in the damp tints of England. He held the paper in the beam of sunlight, reading the familiar loops and curves of her handwriting. She didn't write about grand, sweeping things. She wrote about how the tomatoes in the backyard were finally starting to turn red. She wrote about the stray cat that had started sleeping on their porch. She wrote about the new curtains she had sewn for the living room window. Reading those words in the eerie stillness of the green labyrinth was an anchor to his very soul. The thick walls of earth and the terrifying maze disappeared. For a few precious, quiet minutes, he was standing in his own backyard, smelling the tomato vines, listening to the purr of a sleeping cat. The letter was a thin, paper tether that kept him from drifting away into the shadows of the forest. He pressed the soft paper to his lips, folded it back into its perfect square, and tucked it safely over his heart. As the exhaustion deepened, the silence of the hedgerows became less frightening and more like a lullaby. The isolation transformed into a strange, intimate privacy. They couldn't see the men in the next lane, but they knew they were there. They learned to communicate in soft, breathy whispers that rustled like the wind through the leaves. "Hey, kid," a voice would drift softly through a wall of hawthorn. "You doing okay over there?" "I'm okay," a shaky whisper would float back through the branches. "My boots are just heavy. Take 'em off for a minute. Let your feet breathe. I'm right here if you need me." "Thanks." Those quiet, invisible conversations were the fragile threads that held their courage together. Just knowing that a brother was sitting on the other side of the dirt, listening to the same rustling leaves, feeling the same damp air, made the labyrinth feel less like a trap and more like a shared, quiet room. The terror of the open beach was a memory now, washed away by the tide. The grand, sweeping invasion had fractured into thousands of tiny, personal journeys of survival, played out in the hushed, emerald shadows of the ancient earth. They had crossed the terrifying ocean. They had climbed the unforgiving stone. And now, they had found a place to hide, to breathe, and to remember the beautiful, gentle things they were fighting for. So let the thick, green branches fold over you like a heavy, protective blanket. Let the ancient roots cradle your tired back. The sunken lane is quiet, the dappled sunlight is fading into a soft, restful twilight, and the world beyond the leaves has simply ceased to exist. Breathe in the sweet scent of the moss. Taste the lingering memory of summer fruit. The maze will still be there tomorrow, but for now, you do not have to find your way out. You only have to close your heavy eyes, listen to the gentle whispers of your brothers in the dark, and let the quiet, breathing forest hold you in its safe and ancient arms. Sleep softly, hidden in the green. In the shadow of a grand and terrible storm, the quietest acts of grace are often found hiding just beneath the earth. Beyond the churning beaches and the tangled, green labyrinth of the hedgerows, the ancient, sleeping villages of Normandy were waking to a world they no longer recognized. For generations, these quiet farmhouses made of thick, gray stone had known only the slow, predictable rhythms of the seasons. They knew the smell of the spring rain on the fields, the golden weight of the autumn harvest, and the soft, white silence of winter. But on this night, the wind carried a different, heavier sound, a rolling, mechanical thunder that rattled the heavy wooden shutters and shook the dust from the heavy oak rafters. To escape the sudden, overwhelming storm, the families of these villages did what their ancestors had done for centuries. They gathered their children, wrapped them in thick, woolen shawls, and quietly descended into the dark, damp safety of their root cellars. Imagine stepping down those worn, uneven stone steps, moving away from the noise of the world above. The air down here was incredibly cool and still, holding a deep, earthy fragrance that spoke of absolute peace. It smelled of raw potatoes resting in wooden bins, of damp soil, of dried lavender hanging from the low ceiling, and the sweet, fermented ghost of last autumn's apple harvest. In the center of this small, subterranean room, a single, trembling candle was lit. The flame was a tiny, fragile spear of amber light, pushing back the velvet darkness. It cast long, dancing shadows against the rough stone walls, illuminating the terrified, beautiful faces of a family huddled closely together. A grandmother sat on a low wooden stool, her weathered hands blindly tracing the smooth wooden beads of a rosary, her lips moving in a silent, continuous rhythm of prayer. A mother sat on the packed earth floor, wrapping her arms protectively around two young children, pressing their faces into the soft, faded cotton of her apron so they would not hear the heavy thuds echoing from the road outside. They were trapped in a breathless waiting, entirely at the mercy of the shadows, listening to the footsteps of strangers walking through their beloved, ancient home. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door at the top of the cellar stairs gave a low, agonizing creak. The iron hinges groaned in protest. The family below held their breath, pulling the children tighter, their eyes fixed on the narrow sliver of gray light spilling down the stone steps. Heavy, waterlogged boots appeared first, moving with a slow, agonizing clumsiness, as if the person wearing them was carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. The strangers slowly descended into the trembling amber light. They were not the towering, invincible conquerors the villagers might have expected. They were just boys. They were young, exhausted soldiers, covered from head to toe in the pale chalk of the cliffs, the dark mud of the labyrinth, and the drying salt of the cruel ocean. Their heavy canvas uniforms were torn and soaking wet, hanging off their thin frames like heavy, exhausted ghosts. They held their rifles loosely, their hands shaking so violently from the cold and the fear that the metal parts clattered softly in the quiet room. When the boys reached the bottom of the stairs and looked up, they froze. They saw the flickering candle. They saw the grandmother with her beads, and the mother shielding her children. In that beautiful, fragile moment, the terrifying machinery of the war simply stopped. The boys did not raise their weapons. They did not shout demands. Instead, a profound, heartbreaking relief washed over their smudged, exhausted faces. The absolute tension that had kept them alive on the beach and in the hedgerows suddenly broke, dissolving into the cool, earthy air of the cellar. They lowered their heavy iron rifles, leaning them gently against the stone wall, as if they were afraid of waking a sleeping baby. The leader of the small group, a boy whose helmet was lost to the sea, slowly sank to his knees on the dirt floor. He took off his heavy, wet gloves, revealing hands that were raw and bleeding, and simply covered his face, letting out a long, ragged exhale that sounded like a sob. The mother, still holding her children, looked at the boy on his knees. She did not speak his language. She did not know his name, or the name of the distant town he had left behind to cross the dark water. But looking into his exhausted, trembling frame, she did not see a foreign soldier. She saw a son. She saw a boy who was terribly cold, incredibly frightened, and impossibly far from his own mother's kitchen. Slowly, gently, she untangled herself from her children. She whispered a soft, soothing melody in French, a gentle sound that fluttered through the cellar like a calming dove. She stepped out of the shadows and walked toward the kneeling boy. She did not ask him why he was there. She reached out with a warm, calloused hand and gently rested it on the top of his damp, messy hair. The boy flinched for a fraction of a second, so unused to a gentle touch after a night of unimaginable terror. But then, he leaned into her hand. He leaned into the simple, universal warmth of a mother's comfort, letting his tired eyes close as the tension melted from his neck. The grandmother, moving with the slow, quiet grace of age, stood up from her wooden stool. She shuffled over to a dark corner of the cellar, where a heavy clay jug rested perfectly cool in the shadows. She poured a generous measure into a chipped ceramic mug. It was cider, pressed from the apples in their own orchard, kept sweet and waiting in the dark. She brought the mug to a small cast-iron stove that sat cold in the center of the room, lighting a few small twigs to gently warm the liquid. The sweet, rich scent of warmed apples and cinnamon began to fill the damp cellar, pushing away the sharp, metallic smell of the storm outside. She carried the steaming mug over to the boys, holding it out with hands that trembled just as much as theirs. The young soldier took the mug. The ceramic was incredibly warm, radiating a beautiful, stinging heat into his numb, freezing fingers. He lifted it to his lips and took a slow sip. It was not just a drink. It was a liquid embrace. It tasted of autumn sunlight, of peaceful harvests, and of profound, uncomplicated kindness. It was the taste of a world that had not gone mad. He closed his eyes, letting the warm cider travel down his throat, chasing the cold ocean out of his chest, thawing the fear that had been frozen around his heart since the ramps of the boats first dropped into the surf. He passed the mug to the boy sitting beside him, a silent communion of shared warmth in the dim, flickering light. They sat together on the packed earth floor, these strangers from different sides of the world, bathed in the glow of the single trembling candle. There was no need for spoken words. The silence in the cellar was no longer terrifying. It was a thick, comfortable blanket wrapped around them all. One of the soldiers, his hands finally steady enough to manage the delicate task, reached deep inside his heavy, wet jacket. From a waterproof pouch, he pulled out a small, creased photograph. The edges were soft and worn from being touched 1,000 times in the dark. He held it out into the amber light, offering it to the French mother. She leaned in, the candlelight catching the unshed tears in her eyes. The photograph showed a woman standing on a wooden porch, smiling brightly, holding a small baby wrapped in a knitted blanket. The mother looked at the photograph, then looked up into the boy's tired eyes. She smiled, a soft, beautiful expression that transcended all the borders and oceans in the world. She reached her hand up to her own chest, tapping her heart, and then gently touched the center of the photograph. "I understand," her eyes said. "I am a mother too. I know what you have left behind, and I know what you are fighting to return to." The boy nodded slowly, carefully tucking the photograph back into its safe place over his heart. He felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, heavier and more real than the rifle leaning against the wall. In this tiny, hidden room beneath the earth, he was not a piece of a grand, terrifying machine. He was just a person, sitting with other people, sharing a warm drink while the storm raged outside. The young French children, their initial terror slowly dissolving into innocent curiosity, crept out from the shadows. They approached the soldiers with wide, dark eyes, fascinated by the strange canvas straps and the heavy, muddy boots. One of the soldiers, a boy who had left a little brother of his own back across the sea, reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, slightly crushed piece of chocolate from his rations. He held it out on the flat palm of his hand, completely still, letting the child approach at his own pace. The little boy took the chocolate, his fingers brushing against the soldier's rough hand. He took a tiny bite, his eyes lighting up at the sudden, unexpected sweetness, and then offered the rest to his little sister. It was a fleeting moment, a tiny, fragile spark of joy in a world that felt incredibly dark. But in that spark, the true beauty of peace was remembered. It was not found in grand treaties or the silence of guns. It was found right here, in the sharing of a piece of candy, in the gentle touch of a hand on a tired head, and in the quiet, shared understanding that every heart in that cellar, regardless of the language it spoke, was beating with the exact same hope. For a few precious hours, the war did not exist. The cellar became a sanctuary outside of time. The heavy oak door at the top of the stairs held the noise of the world at bay, allowing the exhausted boys to simply close their eyes and rest. The grandmother returned to her quiet prayers, the mother hummed her gentle songs, and the boys leaned their heads back against the cool stone, their breathing finally slowing to a peaceful, steady rhythm. They drifted into a deep, healing sleep, anchored by the comforting smell of the apples and the soft, dancing light of the candle. They dreamed of their own homes, of their own mothers, of the quiet porches and the sunlit fields they missed so terribly much. When the time finally came for them to leave, to pick up their heavy burdens and step back up the stone stairs into the gray morning light, they would leave a piece of themselves behind in that cellar. And they would carry a piece of that quiet French family with them forever. They would never forget the taste of the warm cider, or the gentle, unspoken grace that had sheltered them in the darkest hours of the storm. So let the heavy oak door remain closed against the wind. Let the trembling candle burn down softly into the night, casting its warm, golden light across the stone. The boys are safe here, hidden beneath the earth, wrapped in the profound, beautiful kindness of strangers. There is no need to worry about the morning just yet. The storm will pass, the sun will eventually rise, but for now, there is only the quiet breathing of the cellar, the sweet scent of the apples, and the deep, unshakable comfort of a shared humanity. Rest your heavy head. Let the quiet songs soothe your mind, and let the gentle, amber light guide you into a peaceful, unbroken sleep. Even the darkest, most terrifying night must eventually surrender to the soft, forgiving light of morning. As the earth slowly turned its bruised and battered face toward the sun, a delicate shift occurred across the fractured landscape of Normandy. The impenetrable, crushing blackness that had hidden so many fears began to thin, dissolving first into a deep, melancholic violet, and then into a fragile, pearlescent gray. The wind, which had howled with such cruel indifference across the churning channel and through the splintered trees, finally began to tire. It softened into a gentle, rhythmic breeze, carrying with it the sweet, clean scent of rain-washed clover and the earthy perfume of the ancient, awakening woods. For the boys scattered across the flooded fields, trapped in the green labyrinth of the hedgerows, and shivering at the crests of the chalky bluffs, this pale light was a miracle. It was the first quiet promise that the world had not actually ended. They had spent hours lost in a terrifying isolation, believing that the grand design had completely fallen apart, believing that they were nothing more than solitary ghosts wandering through a hostile dream. The burden of failure had pressed down upon their narrow shoulders with a weight heavier than any iron pack. They had thought they were the only ones left. But as the mist began to retreat into the deep hollows of the earth, the shadows slowly began to reveal their secrets. A young paratrooper, his face still smudged with the fading remnants of burnt cork, was huddled beneath the broad, sweeping branches of an ancient oak tree. His uniform was heavy with the dampness of the night, and his hands were numb, wrapped tightly around his knees. He had spent the dark hours listening to the terrifying, unfamiliar sounds of the forest, entirely alone. He lifted his heavy head as the first true ray of golden sunlight pierced the thick canopy above. It fell across the muddy ground like a warm, glowing ribbon. And then he heard it. It was not the harsh snap of a breaking branch or the terrifying whistle of falling iron. It was the soft, rhythmic crunch of heavy leather boots moving slowly through the wet grass. He held his breath, his heart fluttering like a trapped moth against his ribs. He peeked through the curtain of leaves, straining his tired eyes against the morning glare. Moving down the narrow, sunken lane, bathed in the soft, golden light, were three silhouettes. They walked with a heavy, dragging limp, their shoulders slumped with an exhaustion he recognized deep within his own bones. He saw the familiar, rounded shape of their helmets. He saw the olive-drab canvas of their jackets. He didn't shout. He didn't have the breath for a cheer. He simply pushed himself up from the roots of the oak tree and stepped out into the middle of the lane. The three walking boys stopped dead. For a breathless second, the world stood entirely still. And then, the boy in the front, a tall kid from a noisy city who looked like he hadn't slept in a month, let out a long, shuddering exhale. His face broke into a smile so profoundly tired and incredibly beautiful that it seemed to light up the shadows around him. "Well," the tall boy whispered, his voice cracking with dry emotion. "I thought we were the only ones left in the whole wide world." The young paratrooper walked toward them, and without a single word of grand greeting, they simply reached out and grasped each other by the shoulders. The grip was tight, desperate, and overflowing with a love that only those who have shared the dark can truly understand. It was the physical feeling of a shattered pieces clicking back together. All across the rolling, green countryside, these quiet, miraculous reunions were taking root in the morning dew. Small, frightened pairs of boys stumbled out of the thick brambles and found themselves face to face with a line of exhausted infantrymen who had just marched up from the cold beach. Glider pilots, their wooden wings shattered in the meadows, linked hands with the medic who had crawled through the surf. Like drops of water slowly merging on a window pane, the scattered, terrified individuals were pooling together, knitting their fractured brotherhood back into a whole. With every new face that appeared from the mist, the immense, suffocating burden of the night began to lift. The quiet terror that they had failed, that the great invasion had been swallowed by the sea and the dark, evaporated into the warming air. They looked around at the growing crowds of muddy, smiling boys, realizing with a sudden, overwhelming clarity, we made it. The plan broke into 1,000 pieces, but we survived the breaking. As this profound relief washed over them, the adrenaline that had kept their hearts racing for so many hours suddenly vanished. In its place, a quiet, bone-deep exhaustion settled heavily over the fields. It was not the terrifying, desperate fatigue of the water. It was a safe, peaceful exhaustion. It was the feeling of a long, terrible journey finally coming to a pause. In a small, open pasture surrounded by high walls of earth, a group of 20 boys simply collapsed into the tall, wet grass. They didn't bother to set up tents or look for cover. They just let their bodies sink into the soft, forgiving ground. They unbuckled their chin straps, pulling their heavy steel helmets off and letting the cool morning breeze weave through their damp, matted hair. One soldier, his boots caked in a thick layer of gray clay, sat on a flat stone and slowly began to unlace his shoes. His fingers were stiff and clumsy, but he moved with a deliberate, reverent care. When he finally pulled the heavy leather off, exposing his aching feet to the air, he closed his eyes and let out a sigh of such pure, unadulterated comfort that the boy sitting next to him couldn't help but laugh, a soft, breathy chuckle that fluttered away on the wind. Another young man lay flat on his back, staring straight up at the pale blue sky. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, a pocket he had desperately tried to keep dry during the violent crossing. He pulled out a small, folded letter. It was slightly damp at the edges, the ink bleeding just a fraction, but the words were still there. He carefully unfolded the delicate paper and laid it flat on his chest, letting the first warm rays of the morning sun touch the page. He wanted the sun to dry the words of his sweetheart. He traced her name with a dirty fingernail, feeling a sudden, warm swelling in his throat. In the dark of the boat, he had wondered if he would ever read this letter in the daylight again. Now, bathed in the soft morning glow, the words looked like a promise. He felt a quiet, absolute certainty that he was going to see her porch again. Small moments of everyday kindness bloomed quietly in the grass. A medic, his own face pale and drawn, moved gently among the resting boys. He didn't have much left in his canvas bag, but he had a clean cloth and a canteen of fresh water. He knelt beside a boy who had a long, angry scrape across his cheek from a fall in the hedgerows. "Hold still, kid," the medic whispered, pouring a tiny splash of water onto the cloth. He reached out and began to wash the boy's face. He wiped away the dark mud, the chalky dust, and the dried sweat of the night. It was an incredibly tender, motherly gesture. The boy closed his eyes, leaning into the cool, damp cloth, letting the medic wash away the physical traces of the nightmare. For a moment, he was just a child with a scraped knee, being cared for in the quiet morning light. They shared whatever they had left. A single, crumpled cigarette was carefully straightened out and lit, the bright flare of the match a tiny beacon of normalcy. They passed it around a circle of 5 men, each taking a slow, deep drag, letting the smoke mingle with the mist rising from the fields. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The simple, rhythmic passing of the paper between their fingers was conversation enough. They were sharing the beautiful, mundane act of simply being alive. The landscape around them, which had seemed so cruel and terrifying in the shadows, began to reveal its true, gentle nature. The ancient apple trees, though bruised by the night, were still standing, their leaves shimmering with dew. The flooded fields reflected the pastel colors of the dawn sky like vast, peaceful mirrors. And in the distance, a single, brave bird began to sing, a high, sweet, trilling note that seemed to apologize for the noise of the dark. The worst was truly behind them. The dark water had been crossed. The impossible cliffs had been climbed. The terrifying fall had ended in the soft earth. They were battered, they were bruised, and they were profoundly, beautifully tired. But as they looked around at the faces of their brothers, illuminated by the fragile, golden light of the new day, they knew that they had weathered the storm. They had held onto each other, and they had pulled the morning out of the dark. So let the golden sun warm your tired shoulders. Let the heavy canvas of your pack fall away into the soft clover. The frantic, desperate night has finally closed its eyes, and the world is asking nothing more of you in this beautiful, suspended moment. Breathe in the sweet scent of the drying earth. Look up at the vast, pale sky, completely empty of thunder. You are surrounded by the quiet breathing of your friends, resting in a peaceful, sunlit field. You have earned this stillness. You have earned this light. Let the profound exhaustion carry you down into a soft, dreamless place. Close your eyes, let the gentle breeze kiss your cheek, and sleep peacefully in the beautiful, quiet dawn. The sea has a beautiful, ancient way of smoothing over the deepest scars of the world. If you were to walk along that long, sweeping curve of coastline today, as the sun begins its slow descent toward the horizon, you would find a place of profound and perfect peace. The tide comes in, and the tide goes out, drawing a gentle, frothing line of white foam across the pale, wet sand. It is a slow, rhythmic breathing, as constant and reassuring as a heartbeat. The wind, once heavy with the terrible, metallic scent of a storm, now carries only the sharp, clean fragrance of salt, the faint sweetness of wild sea oats, and the cool promise of the coming evening. The towering bluffs that once seemed like impossible, unyielding walls are now draped in a soft, verdant blanket of tall grass and delicate wildflowers. They do not look like fortresses anymore. They look like gentle, sleeping giants, resting their weary heads against the edge of the continent. The deep, jagged craters carved into the earth have been softened by the years, transformed by the rain and the wind into shallow, grassy hollows where small birds build their nests and deer come to sleep in the twilight. Nature has quietly, patiently reclaimed the shore. It has woven a tapestry of green and gold over the memories of iron and fear. We do not come to these quiet beaches to remember the heavy machinery of the world. The massive steel ships are gone, melted down or resting peacefully as silent, coral-draped reefs in the dark, silent depths of the ocean. The fragile wooden gliders have long since dissolved back into the damp earth of the meadows, returning their broken wings to the soil. The mechanics of the grand design have faded away, leaving behind only the most important, the most enduring artifact of all. We remember the boys. We remember the soft, hesitant smiles of the young men who crossed the dark water. We remember the way they held each other's hands in the terrifying, freezing surf, and the quiet, breathtaking courage it took simply to take one step forward, and then another. We remember that they were not made of stone or steel, but of fragile hopes, deep longings, and an extraordinary, unconditional love for the brothers walking beside them. Years later, the true monuments of that longest night are not made of concrete or polished marble. They are made of thin, pale paper, folded perfectly into small squares and tucked safely away in cedar boxes on the top shelves of quiet closets. They are the letters. In a quiet farmhouse surrounded by miles of rustling wheat, an old woman sits in a worn armchair, the evening light falling softly across her lap. In her delicate, trembling hands, she holds a letter written in faded, blue ink. It is completely worn at the creases, soft as a piece of old velvet. When she closes her eyes, she does not see a sweeping, chaotic invasion. She sees the boy who wrote those words. She sees him sitting in a damp tent in the English woods, chewing on the end of his pencil, trying to find a way to tell her that he loves her without worrying her. She reads the familiar, looping handwriting. He wrote about a stray dog that had wandered into his camp. He wrote about how much he missed the taste of her Sunday roast, and how he hoped his younger brother was taking care of his bicycle. In those simple, mundane words, the entire terrifying scope of the war simply vanishes. What remains is the pure, unfiltered essence of a gentle soul who just wanted to come home. She presses the soft paper to her cheek, and in the quiet of her living room, she feels his youth, his warmth, and his enduring peace. Across the ocean, in the ancient, winding lanes of Normandy, the green labyrinth has lost its terrifying isolation. The thick hedgerows are just farm borders again, bursting with white hawthorn blossoms in the spring and heavy, dark berries in the late summer. The quiet cellars where terrified strangers once shared warm cider and flickering candlelight are silent now, smelling only of damp earth and aging oak barrels. But the memory of that shared, profound humanity still lingers in the very stones of those old houses. The French families who huddled in the dark never forgot the smudged, exhausted faces of the boys who climbed down their stairs. They told the stories to their children, and their children told them to theirs. They passed down the memory of a piece of sweet chocolate offered by a trembling hand, the soft, reassuring hum of a lullaby shared across a language barrier, and the absolute, beautiful truth that even in the darkest of storms, the human heart seeks only to comfort and to be comforted. The earth forgives, and the earth remembers. Sometimes, an old man will return to the sweeping, windswept beach. He does not walk with the heavy, frantic rush of his youth. He walks slowly, leaning softly on a wooden cane, the rubber tip sinking gently into the wet sand with every step. He wears a warm coat against the sea breeze, and his eyes, surrounded by the deep, beautiful lines of a long life, look out over the gray water. He is not looking for medals, and he is not looking for glory. He is looking for a ghost. He is looking for the exact spot on the shingle where he lay shivering in the cold morning mist, feeling the absolute certainty that he could not take another breath. He stops at the edge of the surf, letting the shallow, foaming water rush up to touch the toes of his shoes. He closes his eyes and listens to the rhythmic crash of the waves. In the hush of the sea wind, the roar of his past dissolves. He doesn't hear the terrifying thunder anymore. He hears the quiet, scratchy voice of the older baker who lay beside him, telling a foolish, wonderful joke to make him smile. He feels the phantom weight of a hand resting gently on his shoulder, a silent promise that said, "I am right here. We will climb the stairs together." He reaches into his deep coat pocket and pulls out a small, smooth river stone. He has carried it every single day since he left his front porch so many years ago. It has been rubbed perfectly smooth by decades of anxious thumbs and quiet reflections. He holds it tight for just a moment, feeling the warmth of his own hand seep into the stone. And then, with a slow, graceful arc of his arm, he tosses the stone out into the surf. It breaks the surface with a tiny, silent splash, sinking down into the cool, dark water. It is a quiet offering. A giving back of the weight he has carried for an entire lifetime. He takes a long, deep breath of the salt air, filling his lungs with the peaceful, unburdened morning, and he smiles. A soft, beautifully tired smile. The heavy debt of his youth is finally paid, washed away by the gentle, uncaring, beautiful ocean. The footprints they left in the sand that morning were washed away before the sun even set. The tide came in, as it always does, and smoothed the beach into a perfect, flawless canvas, completely erasing the physical evidence of their impossible struggle. But the impression they left on the soul of the world is permanent. We walk in the freedom of their quiet resilience. We sleep under the blanket of their extraordinary sacrifice. The boys who climbed the impossible cliffs, who crossed the terrifying dark, who pulled each other from the freezing tide, did not do it to conquer the world. They did it so the world could be quiet again. They endured the greatest storm so that the generations after them could walk along a peaceful beach and only have to worry about the sand in their shoes. Just above the beach, resting on the soft, green bluff overlooking the sea, there is a place of absolute, unbroken serenity. Row upon row of pristine, white stones catch the golden light of the setting sun. They stand in perfect, quiet harmony, surrounded by ancient, whispering pines and the sweet scent of manicured grass. It is not a place of sorrow. It is a place of profound, eternal rest. The boys who stayed behind are not cold, and they are not frightened anymore. They are sleeping together, shoulder to shoulder, just as they did in the damp forests of England, just as they did in the narrow wooden gliders, and just as they did in the freezing, tossing boats. But now, their sleep is completely untroubled. The heavy canvas packs have been laid down. The terrifying noise has been silenced forever. They are wrapped in the soft, warm earth, cradled by the gentle sound of the ocean they crossed, watched over by the quiet, turning stars. When the wind sweeps gently through the trees above them, it sounds like 1,000 soft, rushing whispers. It sounds like the rustle of a letter being opened. It sounds like the striking of a match to light a shared cigarette in the dark. It sounds like the deeply comforting murmur of a friend saying, "Sleep now. The morning is here. The world is safe." So let the evening draw its long, soft shadows across the sand. Let the cool mist roll in from the sea, wrapping the coastline in a protective, silver twilight. The long journey is over. The heavy iron has sunk, the splintered wood has vanished, and the terrible fears have all blown away on the wind. All that remains is the breathtaking beauty of a world at peace, gifted to us by the softest, bravest hands. Listen to the rhythmic breathing of the waves against the shore. In and out. In and out. A slow, eternal lullaby for the boys who gave us everything. Breathe in the calm, quiet night. Let the profound, beautiful peace of the empty beach settle deep into your own tired bones. There is nothing left to fight, nothing left to carry, nothing left to fear. The footprints have been washed away, leaving only the beautiful, unbroken sand. Rest your head, close your heavy eyes, and let the gentle, whispering tide carry you into a deep, safe, and beautiful slumber. All is quiet. All is well. Sleep softly in the peace they left behind.